Bantam Doubleday Dell Audio Publishing presents Shadow Moon, Book 1 of the Saga of the Shadow War, by George Lucas and Chris Claremont. In the middle of the night, Willow Ufgood rode the back of a dragon. It was a dream. Had to be. He'd gone to bed quite a bit later than usual after a hard day in the fields. The whole family pitched in to help, but the children were still too young to handle stock, and as it was Kaya's special gift to charm the green, growing things of the earth, so it was Willow's to speak to the animals that walked upon it. Occasionally, though, he considered that a mixed blessing, as with today, when his pig decided to behave like a pig and take it into its head that plowing was beneath its station. He couldn't force the beast. It stood as tall as he and outweighed him by more than he cared to think about, which meant he had to resort to persuasion. In that moment, and only for the moment, the world seemed to shift, turning back on itself a whole year. Same field, same situation, although the pig wasn't acting nearly so pig-headed. Willow tilling his soil, as his father had done, and his father before him, and so on back as far as memory went in Nelwyn Vale, distracted suddenly by the cries of his children that they'd found a baby in the bulrushes. That moment had changed his life forever, and the fate of the world in the bargain. The day he'd rescued the sacred Princess Elora Danan. Later in the evening, when the children were safely tucked to bed, he retired to his workshop off the back of the house proper. Originally, it was where he stored his tools and made whatever was needed in the way of furniture for the house. Now, in addition, it was where he practiced his magic. On the table was the gift he'd been making for the princess. It was a stuffed bear. Its fur was golden to match her hair. The arms and legs swiveled, so that if Elora hugged the bear, it would feel as though the bear was hugging her back. The bear had actually been finished the better part of a fortnight. Time for even a Nelwyn messenger to carry it to Elora's home, the fabled Daikini fortress of Tir Asleen. Willow had intended to present it himself, but the time he'd have been away would have cost him the better part of this year's crops, and that was a loss his family could ill afford. He turned his gaze to his hands. A year ago, they'd been a farmer's hands, and he a proper Nelwyn with dreams of becoming a sorcerer's apprentice. Now he was a wizard true, and he felt the power crackle within him with every beat of his heart. "Some power," he muttered. "Some wizard who can't even persuade a pig to pull a plow." He went to bed, taking care not to wake Kaya as he snuggled his way gently beneath the sheets. He beat his pillow into its proper shape and rolled over onto his side. To behold the whole wide world, far, far below. He cried out. The dragon laughed. He was nestled in the hollow of a set of shoulders so broad they would easily have fit his entire farm, staring up at a neck that topped the tallest tree he'd ever seen. He didn't want to think of how far the creature stretched in the other direction. Great wings reached out from where he stood, beating only occasionally as the dragon let wind and air do most of the work of keeping it aloft. In spite of himself, Willow pushed to his feet, taking hold of one of the double row of dorsal spines that ran the length of the dragon's back from skull to tail. At this juncture, they stood easily twice the height of a tall Daikini, which made them nearly 4 times his own. The dragon's line of flight put this side of the dorsals in sunlight, and even that faint and fading radiance he saw was enough to paint the body and wings in crystalline fire, as though the dragon were formed of the same golden, glowing substance as the sun itself. It was a beauty so wild, so elemental, it made him ache. No less wondrous was the world through which they flew. Normally, heights terrified him. Here, though, he felt no fear. and decided that was probably because it was so far a fall, his mind simply refused to deal with it. Or better yet, since this was a dream, had to be a dream, he told himself, there was nothing in it that could truly do him harm. So why not stop fretting and enjoy both flight and view?
Why not indeed?
The dragon said companionably. You knew what I was thinking.
Think more quietly, then. I'll wager there isn't a creature within mind sight of your dwelling Nelwyn doesn't know your every secret.
Willow flushed furiously, as scarlet as the sunset.
I'm Denier, Callan Denier.
Willow Offgood.
Savior of Alora Dannon, slayer of the demon witch Queen Bovmorda. I know. You've quite a reputation.
They flew, and below them was only water, more water than Willow imagined could exist in all the world. Where does it go, Denier, this water?
To another land. Only there this is called the Sunrise Sea, and beyond that land another ocean, and so on, until at last we come back to where we started.
Are there people?
Domains there as here, all the realms of the Vale folk, plus what you would call Daikini in their mad variety. Kingdoms galore, the greatest being Anguin, which is as far from your home, young Magus, as it's possible to go.
There was a rush of wind, exceptionally gentle considering the size of the creature that generated it, as Denier belled his wings and extended his hind legs for landing. Willow saw they were in a different valley, in a land of rolling hills. Willow assumed the dragon had cast some sort of glamour over the castle to mask its presence. He had no other explanation for the failure of any sentries to sound the alarm as the head arched delicately forward to rest on the topmost battlements. Willow wasted no time clambering from his perch. I'll ask again, Denier, he said, turning. Is there some He was speaking to darkness and open sky. The beast was gone, as if it had never been. There were torches everywhere along the parapet and walls, arrayed at intervals on poles across the courtyards below, illuminating the bailey to a fair semblance of daylight. There was a day's worth of activity as well. A tumult of people and animals, carts and their cargo, scurrying purposefully to complete the preparations for the upcoming days of celebration. Willow took stock of himself as he hurried along, mindful that, dream or no, he wanted to look his best. He donned his nightshirt before bed, but that was gone, replaced by his usual rustic garb. Willow's hair was shoulder-length and full, mahogany brown at first glance, but shot through with streaks of fiery russet. What he saw in his mirror was a plain man, whose goal was to do honorably by himself, his family, his friends. That was what he offered the world, and all he asked of it in return. If he thought of himself as molasses, then the figures dueling along the parapet were the wildest silver. One was dark, the other fire. Both were Daikini, a man and a woman, lithe and lean, with the bodies and moves of warriors. The black-haired man stood a head taller, but the difference offered no disadvantage. The only spot of color about the black-garbed woman was her red hair, which looked as if she'd been dunked into a vat of autumnal flame. Willow sat down and watched the show. The woman clocked her opponent soundly with her sword hilt, and when he cried out, she tripped his legs out from under him. Before his rump struck stone, she was away with the merriest laugh, daring him to follow her up a flight of stairs and around the corner of the battlements. He cast about, seemingly in confusion, as if unsure which way to go. A moment later, he launched himself into the air, describing a great arc across the bailey, at the end of the halyard used for lifting armaments to the top of the wall. His plan was to swing ahead of her and be waiting when she emerged. Unfortunately, he chose to land right where Willow was sitting. It was a most impressive collision, despite the Nelwyn's last-ditch attempts to scramble clear. "Damn you, Nelwyn!" he heard as they untangled themselves. "What god did your kind annoy when they were handing out sizes, eh? Too small to notice, too bloody big to avoid. I'm pleased to see you too, Madmartigan. Sorcia's contribution to the conversation was a delighted bubble of laughter as she crossed a pair of swords, hers and her husband's, at Madmartigan's throat. I yield. Now may we dance? Carefully, for the blades were honed more keenly than any razor, she set aside the weapons and kissed him. I thought you weren't coming, Madmartigan said to Willow. I'm not coming. I'm not here. The two Daikini exchanged deadpan looks. But I will say I can't remember when I've had a more wild dream. How'd you make the trip? On the back of a dragon. Sorcia smiled. Sounds like a dream to me. As long as I'm here, Willow announced, I'll look in on Elora Danan. You always call her by name, Drumheller, Sorcia said. To most everyone else here, she's Her Royal Highness the Sacred Princess. To me, Elora Danan is who she is. I changed her wrappings too often to consider her a sacred princess anything. What did you call me, Sorcia? Drumheller. A warrior term my father taught me before Bavmorda did away with him. A sadness swept her fine features. Part pathfinder, part stalking horse, he or she is the warrior sent ahead of all the rest to charm an ambush out of hiding. It's how I've come to think of you. Your thoughts are more generous than mine. Damn, but you're a thorny bugger sometimes, Willow. Madmartigan clapped him gently on the shoulders. At my size, words have to serve as well as knives for weapons. Unlike you, Daikini, it's not so easy for us to impose our will on others. Not so easy for us either, sometimes especially where it concerns the Veil folk and the realms beyond. The sharpest steel is no match for spells. I suppose you're right. There's always somebody bigger, some force greater, as there are those beneath you in the scale of things. Moments like this strikes me Willow's not the name for you. Bends too easily. All Nelwyns bend, Madmartigan. It's part of how we survive. Maybe so, but anyone fool enough to take a hand to you, I'll wager it comes away bloody. You're not a good Willow, my friend, or a good Nelwyn. There's way too much steel in your soul. I have it, Sorcia announced. For the duration of this dream, let you henceforth be known as Thorn Drumheller. Faster than Willow could follow, she drew her sword and tapped him on the shoulder with the flat of her blade, as for a knightly investiture. Enough of this foolishness. I'm going to find Elora Danan. Elora's apartments were located in the Royal Tower, the core of the castle. The rooms were sumptuously appointed, but it was still impossible to disguise the fact that Tir Asleen was first and foremost a military stronghold. Elora, Madmartigan, and Sorcia shared an entire floor, their bedroom next to hers. "Halt! Stand and deliver!" Willow heard as he stepped across the threshold. A moment later, for emphasis, he felt the sting of a brownie arrow in his backside. "That's not nice," Willow said sternly, yet softly, because he didn't want to wake Elora. "Careless big fella he, eh?" said a voice from behind, and Rule strode stiff-legged into view, the brownie's body nearly masked by the weave of the carpet. "In a rowdy humor tonight, are we?" Willow wondered. "Looks the same as always," offered another voice, Rule's companion, Frangine. "Talks different, though. Putting on airs. Could be an imposter." "Trust me, I'm me." Willow crossed to the bed for a closer look at his goddaughter. She was still one of the most beautiful things he'd ever seen. Her hair was spun gold. She was plump, but babies were supposed to be so at her age. She was someone whose natural state was a smile of delight and wonder at the world arrayed before her. "Thought you weren't coming, big fella." Rule had scrambled lithely to a perch on Elora's bedstead. "It's a dream. I'm at home, Rule, asleep in my own bed." "If you say so." "Me?" Frangine said. "I say it's guilt. Elora's celebration it is. A year tomorrow since she came to Tiraslin. Is Willow, her godfather, her savior, coming to be part of the festivities? He says not. He has to tend to his precious fields. I don't plant now, my family doesn't eat later. You're a wizard, Willow, said Rule. You'll manage. Does he at least send a present for the little lovely? Frangine continued remorselessly. I don't see one. Willow was about to say no when some inspiration prompted his hand toward the traveling pouch on his left hip. His pouches were one of his earliest successes in learning the art and craft of magic. The apparent size of the bag bore no relationship whatsoever to the volume within or how much it could carry. Food would stay fresh, water wouldn't spill. All he had to do was think about what he needed and reach in. Which is what happened. He thought of the bear, and there it was. Let my bear stand in my stead. Will that be acceptable, Highness? All that I would be, were I here, let him represent. He was seized with a rush of inspiration. I can add a portion of my strength to yours through my bear. That will make your defenses as comprehensive and resilient now as when you'll be full grown. Willow tucked the bear snug under the crook of her arm. As if that had been all she was waiting for, Elora rolled toward him, wrapping both arms and legs about the bear to ensure the stuffed animal's safe imprisonment. He rearranged her covers, missing in the process a hurried conference between the brownies, where they decided there was no way they were letting him travel home alone in so obviously demented a state. They were inside his traveling pouch before he knew what they were about, and try as he might to get them out, they remained well and truly hidden. There was one final obligation easily fulfilled. He smoothed Elora's hair from her brow and gave her a kiss and a wish for the sweetest of dreams, the happiest of tomorrows. And that was that. The next he knew, it was morning. He woke with a start beside his wife, where he'd known he'd been all the night through. He was so thankful for that realization that it was a long few moments before his mind registered what his eyes beheld from the first. A pair of brownies sitting side by side at the foot of his bed. After that, giving the lie to the loveliness of sunrise, he learned that while he'd slept, the world as he'd known it had come to its end. The eagles told him the rider was close. Thorn didn't see. The brownies were nervous enough around the tall folk in their own country, but there at least they had a wealth of trees and undergrowth to mask their presence. Here, in the shadow of the great mountain range that split the continent from top to bottom, there was nothing but prairie grassland from slopes to horizon. They wanted to hide and told Thorn so repeatedly. Thorn didn't hear. The animal's every step bespoke a fatigue sunk deep into her bones. She'd run as far and fast as she was able, but she was done. The scent of fear was strong from her, its cause brutally clear from the fresh wounds that scarred her flanks and haunch. A Daikini warrior sat atop her back, the young man's boots scored by the same claws that had slashed his mount. The trail they followed would bring them right to Thorn and his companions. The pace they maintained meant they'd reach them near nightfall. Thorn didn't care. His own boots cast puffs of dirt into the air as he made his way to the edge of the scar. Dust without any of the weight or consistency of proper earth, leached dry of moisture, of minerals, of life itself. Until 12 years ago, a mountain stood here, paramount in the range. That awful night, as cataclysms and disasters raged across the whole of the 12 domains, it had simply been destroyed, one sight among many. Thorn had seen all manner of natural disasters, and how quickly nature rushed back to heal the wounds. Here, though, Normal rules seemed no longer to apply, and nothing had stepped in since to fill the void. "Just the same," he said aloud, mainly to break the eerie silence. The ground within the scar had been seared to bedrock, fused on top to glass, so that the scene most resembled a shallow bowl, although this one was miles across and easily 100 feet deep. In his mind's eye, Thorn saw another field of primal desecration, this one set amidst rolling woodlands, a place once renowned for its beauty, forever ruined. The strength of its walls, the courage of its knights, the skill of its sorcerers, none of that had saved the fabled Daikini fortress of Tir Asleen. The castle and its rulers embodied the hope of the world, and it had been wiped away in a single instant. Thorn was closer to this place now than he had been to the fortress at that moment 12 years ago. Then he had stood at the head of the valley, staring with dulled eyes as though he himself had become one of the dead. The sole legacy of the scar was a resonance that led Thorn from one sight to the next with the same inexorable force of the pole for a compass needle. After the first few, and as he honed his talent as a wizard, the pattern of destruction had become clear. Each location was a place of power, a crossroads where the lines of energy of the physical world intersected with their counterparts in the realms beyond, the domains of Fairy, home to the Veil folk. As a consequence, the devastation had been as great in their lands, and the scars as deep. Each party had its own opinion as to the cause and reason. Each had a favorite place to lay blame, with the net result that relations among the 12 domains, never comfortable on the best of days, went into a steep decline. Beyond the obvious, that a force of mind-numbing power had in a single savage moment annihilated a score of points across the whole of the world, nothing was known. Not the nature of the force or its purpose, and few were eager to learn the answers, as though doing so would call down the same doom upon their own heads. It was a choice Thorn himself faced at every sight. He had known from the start that it was required of him to find answers, yet in each instance he found himself holding back. He was no less reluctant today. "Is this it, then?" he asked himself. "A dozen years on the road, in hiding, all for nothing. You saved the best for last, Peck." And he made the diminutive as cruel an insult as any who'd used it against him. "The resonances are as strong here as at Tir Asleen itself. If there are answers to be found, there's nowhere better." The cataclysm had left its mark on Thorn as much as the land. He was leaner than he'd been, his body toughened by his wanderings across the face of the globe. His skin was tight across his face, giving him the aspect of a Nelwyn twice his age. It was his eyes that marked him most, though. They were haunted eyes that had seen too much. Thorn anchored a stanchion deep into the earth, with a length of line tied snug about it, looped it around his waist, and threw a metal ring affixed to his belt. He donned well-worn buckskin gloves to protect his hands and tossed the rope over the edge. Putting his back to the scar, he took hold of his line and stepped off the rim. As soon as he touched bottom and disengaged his harness, a piece of rock caught his eye, hardly bigger than a thumbnail. He picked it up, rolled it a few moments between his palms, his eyes half closed, senses building a picture of the stone within his mind. Great age, he felt, and yet, as the world viewed such things, this particular peak had hardly been born. Young and fresh, its stark, sharp lines barely touched by sun and wind and water. There was strength to it, and special pride. This was a place of power. He thrust the pebble into a pocket of his vest and wandered deeper across the crater. He'd walk one way, then another, pass stones by, pick one up, toss it aside, then inexplicably go back to one he'd skipped before to add it to the growing collection. Each step brought him a flash-fire image of every aspect of the peak's existence, from birth to sudden early death. Slowly, working by intuition, he began placing one stone after the other on the ground before him. When at last his pocket was empty, he'd built a fair-sized pile. He was looking at the mountain in small, the towering central spire, a sheer drop to the plainsward side, with two subordinate ridges binding it to the range beyond. He looked around, aware of the wind and of the wailing undertone of anguish in its voice. "I'm sorry," he said to the cairn he was forming. "I wish I could undo what's been done." A furious gust of energy from out of the heart of the mountain struck upward and knocked him flat. He was consumed by heat. It wasn't pain, but it was nearly more than he could bear. He was sure that he was glowing. He turned his head, his body following, seeming to flow. Parts of him liquefied, then recast themselves once more when he came to rest. As he surveyed the stony boneyard, there was a form and structure to the landscape that he hadn't perceived before. He realized he could now complete consciously what he'd begun solely on instinct. There was a way to set things right. He could gather the pieces of the remains and restore them in the proper sequence. It wouldn't be easy to rebuild a mountain by hand, but he knew he was up to it. He caught sight of the next stone to add to his construction and began his glacial trek toward it. With every breath, he became more content. This was peace. This was fulfillment. He felt a swash of air as something large passed close by overhead, the impact, faintly felt, of tiny feet on his shoulders. The next he knew, equally small fingers had grabbed a respectable handful of nose hair. The brownie tugged, and Thorn popped back into his own head with an outraged yelp and a tremendous sneeze.
"Talking to you, Sarah!"
cried Frangine.
"Saving you!"
echoed his companion.
"Can we go now, please?"
"Hang on, Rule!" cried Frangine, and then the eagles were upon them. Two sets of claws sank deep through the fabric of Thorn's vest, closing securely without doing any harm. He felt the backwash of powerful wings as he was summarily yanked from the ground.
"Careless,"
said Bastian, not bothering to hide his disdain as he muscled his limp burden skyward.
"A fledgling's mistake,"
sniffed his mate, Anella, holding guard position just off Bastian's left wing. Thorn couldn't think of anything to say, so he cast his awareness outward to join with Anella's. As always, the view took his breath away. He luxuriated in the caress of air across his skin, all the sensations of flight that were hers. Then he was unceremoniously dumped on the ground close by their campsite. "That wasn't very nice," he grumped at the brownies.
"We tried to get your attention,"
Rule said. Thorn made a face. "I didn't hear you," he told them all. A voice to the brownies, mind speech to the eagles who were flying high in the darkening eastern sky.
"Too busy spirit dancing."
"I ask your pardon. It's one thing to risk my own life. I had no right to make you do the same."
"Find what you are looking for?"
asked Frangine with malicious glee. "No," was his flat reply.
"You've looked for 10 years and more, Drumheller. If you haven't learned by now, when?"
Frangine was right. Thorn's search had taken him across the face of the world, yet he felt no closer to his answers today than when he set out. It was a realization that had been growing in him for a long time. He had doubly failed, not only to save those he loved, but also to avenge them.
"Are you quite finished?"
Thorn demanded.
"Will you ever be?"
Rule spoke up.
"This isn't the time, Frangine."
Over the years, Frangine had grown into a veritable peacock, with nary a stitch out of place regardless of circumstance. Rule, by contrast, was the more practical of the pair. His clothes were so comfortably broken in, they seemed like they'd been part of him forever. In this instance, buckskin mainly.
"The daikini."
Rule reminded his companion, with an edge to his tone that matched the keenness of the blades he wore at his belt. "What daikini?" Thorn asked. Frangine cocked a dismissive eyebrow.
The one we've been screaming at you about all this livelong day?
Thorn followed the brownies through the scrub brush and tumbleweed. The daikini had chosen as good a defensive position as could be managed on this barren land. He'd stripped a good-sized clearing and used the gathered tinder for an impressive fire. The man's horse snuffled. In the recent past, she'd taken a nasty wound from which she'd never truly recovered. A glance told Thorn all he needed to know. Death dogs. Their bites were lethally septic. He could smell their poison within her.
Deserves it, he does. That's what I say,
Frangine said in his ear. So quick to condemn, Thorn replied.
To fight a pack of death dogs and not expect them to follow? Too stupid to live, you ask me.
I thought we were done with them. That we'd slain those few who survived Bavmorda.
Evidently not.
The brownies had already climbed over the man searching for information.
See the device on his coat? He's sworn to somebody's service.
Thorn nodded. The king in Angwin. He's a pathfinder. Another wanderer far from home. Thorn cast with his ghostly senses, his insight, feeling no direct awareness of the death dogs, but he knew that meant nothing. They were bred to hide themselves from adepts of any kind, woodsmen, warriors, and magi. The daikini has to be warned, he told his companions, and stepped clear of the rocks that had been his hiding place. Out of habit he moved silently, but the moment Thorn stirred, the daikini was out of his bedroll and into a combat crouch, drawn saber at full extension. The daikini challenged him. "Stay your distance, or you're being followed." Thorn overrode his words, his arms open to reassure the warrior he meant no harm. "Them damn wolves again. Took care of 'em the first time, do the same again." As he spoke, the daikini gathered up his crossbow, cocked it, and put an arrow into place. "They aren't wolves," Thorn held up a hand to forestall questions, "and they're here." He scrambled around the fire, making for the daikini's horse, cursing the fact his stunted legs forced him to waddle when the daikini could have been there in 2 steps. He was barely there when the poor animal shrieked in terror and pain, but mostly, he realized, defiance. A death dog sprang into view, charging straight up the slope, announcing its attack with the gobbling snarl that was their trademark. Part of the daikini's equipment was a scabbard of short spears, though short still meant a weapon twice the Nelwyn's height. Thorn pulled one free, slamming the butt against the earth, using his body to brace it in place. The hound twisted away in midair, and Thorn was swept by the sick surety that it would dodge him. Bastion swooped right then, throwing his wings wide to pull out of a tremendous dive, lashing out at the dog with his claws. It always amazed him that the eagles could fall so far and fast and still survive. The death dog took a fatal snap at the attacker, even as Bastion muscled himself out of reach. A moment later, as it realized its mistake, it had impaled itself on Thorn's spear. Across the way, the daikini put a bolt into the breast of another dog, the force of the impact tumbling the beast onto its forelegs. Thorn was there before it could rise again to hammer the point of another spear through its skull. "Your sword!" he bellowed to the daikini. "Sever the head!" With a 2-handed strike, the deed was done. Thorn lost count of how many they killed. The battle was so fierce he hardly had time to think, certainly none to plan. There was no sign of the brownies, who'd gone to ground until it was safe. The eagles weren't in view either. Surrounded by a pack of dogs, Thorn kept them away with a brand grasped from the fire. He waved the torch, keeping the beasts at a distance. Snapping their teeth, they dodged the flames easily. Thorn charged a breath with a streamer of power, huffed it down the length of his torch, and flames exploded outward from the burning tip. This his death dogs hadn't expected. One of them backpedaled furiously, right into one of its charging fellows, the collision sending the pair into a tumble. They recovered almost immediately and took up the chase, for Thorn was on the run as fast as he could manage, out of the campsite and across the boulder-strewn field. His slim lead vanished with every step. His advantage was that he hadn't far to go. The mountains sensed his approach. He was counting on that. He fed more power to the fire until his torch blazed with a blinding light. Another portion of power he used to mask this from the death dogs. 6 steps from the crater, he spun in his tracks and pulled the hood that hid his torchlight, flashing the solar radiance full in the death dogs' slavering faces. His next step hit empty air. He'd reached the scar. He let himself go, and the torch as well, grabbing for purchase as he crashed against the crater wall. Witch lights began flickering beneath the glassy surface, even before the death dogs leapt after him and landed. The mountains recognized a resonance of the power that had maimed them years before, and took the opportunity to strike back with all their might. Between one step and the next, the death dogs turned from flesh to molten fire, retaining form and animation for a step farther until they cooled. For an instant, Thorn beheld a pair of monstrously ugly statues. Then they were reduced to dust. He heard the stealthy pad of feet approaching from behind, and he dropped and rolled. This attacker walked on 2 legs, Thorn noted in passing as he recovered his feet. Thorn's recognition of his attacker's face almost got him killed a second time. "Farron!" he called. Then the knife flashed, and there was no more opportunity for deliberate thought. Thorn's body reacted as it had been trained to do. One hand to block the thrusting blade, another to clutch the boy's tunic. Feet presenting themselves to Farron's solar plexus, he sent the boy into a flying somersault. Farron tried to land like a death dog, twisting to his feet and facing his foe, but his body hadn't yet grown sufficiently to fulfill those demands. The boy struck hard, shoulder first, that impact costing him his hold on the knife, which Thorn immediately kicked over the edge of the scar. Farron opened his mouth, bearing long fangs. When he flexed his fingers, Thorn caught a gleam of claws where human nails once had been. "Farron, no!" A waste of breath. Thorn knew that when he spoke. The boy sprang, but the Nelwyn stood his ground and caught Farron's hands in his own. The boy snapped his teeth, trying for Thorn's throat, but Thorn had a slight advantage in arm length and put it to good use, pushing up and away, stretching Farron's arms to full extension. There was blood on the boy's breath. He knew there was no hope, a foregone conclusion the moment Farron had tasted blood, tasted death. But he turned the full force of his insight on the boy, regardless, praying to find a remnant of the lad he'd brought into the world. As he did so, his fingers tightened their grip. He bent the boy backward, more and more, until at last, with an awful crack, Farron's spine broke. Thorn dropped beside him, gathering the boy gently into his lap. There was only blind hatred in Farron's eyes, the lust of a death dog eager for its kill. He had hoped to see something more. Such was the way with death dogs. The hounds themselves were animal. The leader of a hunting pack, however, had to be human and embrace this abominable path as an active choice. Thorn yearned to repay 1,000-fold the one who'd murdered the soul of this boy and bring to the creature responsible such pain and more as he felt now. The walk back to camp was an interminable slog. Thorn found the Daikini bruised and shaken, but unhurt. The horse, however, lay on her side, and Thorn marveled that there was blood enough within her for her noble heart still to pump. She responded to his presence as he knelt beside her. He cast loose his own spirit, and with his insight reached deep into the mare. They merged, and in that moment he understood the transcendent physical glory of running. He cleansed the poison from her system. He smoothed the chipped and broken bones. He stitched the slashes on her body closed. All the while he kept her blood burning through her veins. At the same time he grew ever more cold. His skin paled, lips and fingertips turning slightly blue, as though he'd been sketched with ice. Life remained within him solely as an act of will. All else was devoted to his patient. At long last he let his head loll forward. The mare's head lay in his lap. She radiated his cleansing warmth, and he drew on that to restore some sensation to his frozen hands. As the sun rose the next morning, the mare whickered, bending her legs gingerly at first, as though to reassure herself they were still attached. She tucked them under herself, then rolled to her feet. "Windfleet," Thorn said, as though knowing her name was as natural as knowing his own. "Tough lady." He sensed a change in her mood as he picked up a stray bit of tack, her bridle. Windfleet wasn't happy to see it, and as he turned the construction of leather and steel in his hand, he felt his mouth twist in sympathetic memory, a resonance of the bond he and the mare had shared. He flicked the bridle aside, then turned to the mare with a shrug of his shoulders and a lift of his hands, as if to say, "What, you're still here?" He offered a bow, which she returned. With a cry of pure delight, she sped from the campsite, picking her way unerringly along a path only she could see, until she reached the open plains. The Daikini's name was Jerin Havelhand. When he woke, he wasn't happy to find his horse gone. As it was their sole mode of transport, neither were the brownies. But with surprising ease, Jerin modified his saddle into a fairly serviceable backpack. Thorn had his own tasks to perform. He hooked his hands under the armpits of the last of the hounds and backpedaled towards the scar, then let the creature fall to its grave. He did the same thing again and again, until there was only one left.
"Leave it lie, Thorn,"
said a small voice, with a rare use of the name Sorsha had given him.
"Was a sorcerer who made him do the killing, Drumheller," Frangine said. "There's no blame on you for what was done here."
"Doesn't matter. This is my job, because the shadow arts are involved, and I may well be the only one with even a hope of bringing the fiend responsible to justice." He took the boy in his arms, ignoring the protests of his muscles, and made his way to the edge of the crater. "I should have found you sooner, Farron. For that, I am truly sorry." He couldn't let go. The boy had to be dropped, as the dogs had been, so that not even ashes would be left to further befoul this already blighted landscape. Suddenly, the air about him blazed hot as a furnace. Streamers of raw flames swirled around his legs, up his back, over his shoulders, down his arms, and stretched themselves along the body that he held until it was as encased as he. With the faintest pop of imploding air, both fire and burden were gone, the one reducing the other to less than ashes, as though it had never been. Thorn was untouched, at least in body. He waited for a moment as the mountain spirits kept a healthy distance. He made a helpless gesture, not really an apology, for there was nothing he could say that could take away the hurt inflicted here, and he'd already refused to do what was wanted of him. At the last, he simply said, "Thank you." "Whatever the hell you doing, Peck?" demanded a voice from on high. Diminutive term for a diminutive people, favored by those lacking sufficient wit to see beyond the obvious. He hated it. "Just tidying up." Thorn gathered up his pack and followed the Daikini to the outer edge of the brush, where it faded into scrub grass and boulders. There Jerin paused. "You healed my horse." "You are a witchy boy." "Hardly," which was as far as he dared stretch the truth, since he didn't consider himself a witch, and hadn't been a boy in longer than he cared to remember. The young man fiddled on his feet from one to the other as if his boots pinched. "Whatever. Stood by me. Did your fair share on the killing ground. Scales between us, they're most likely balanced." As they started on their way, Thorn said, "If you've a different path to walk, my friend, I'll not be offended."
"First, a Daikini along a trail few of his kind have ever ridden,"
said Frangine in his ear, from a perch atop Thorn's shoulder, snugged among the folds of his cloak.
"Then a great hunt of death dogs. Interesting coincidence, don't you think?"
"I'd rather not think at all, thank you very much." "No game around here." That was Jerin, blissfully unaware of Thorn's other conversation. "No water along my back trail. Leastways, not that we can reach in time. They've been all fouled by the death dogs.
Do you know this country?
Shake of the head. No reason to. No settlements up this way, not even wanderer bands. Suppose this is King's land. Probably claim it's so in Angwin, but only 'cause it's here. Ain't even been proper mapped.
Then what brought you here?
A fool's errand, I was starting to think. Was told there was a healer roaming the high country. Been trouble on the river. Needed help bad, that's what was said. I'm good on a trail. Figured I'd bring him in.
No fool you, Jeren, at least in that regard.
You're the healer, then?
Among other things.
Had a fair chance mounted. A foot hard and bare as this country is, don't know how long it'll take to reach the settlement. Thorn pointed across the plain, a little to the left of the sunrise.
3 days that direction will bring us to a river, an uplands tributary of the Serenya.
Not much use, unless you have a boat handy. Thorn allowed himself a smile.
You never know.
So the lad found you, did he, Drumheller?
Mulroon called. He had anchored his keelboat in midstream, and long before reaching the river, Thorn saw the telltale flash of a telescope being levelled in their direction.
Good thing for both of us that he did. The great hunt came for us that very night.
Mulroon was as sour-faced as ever, as though he'd been kept waiting, just this side of eternity. Not so tall as Jeren, this Daikini was built like a barrel, and was just as hard to move when he wasn't in the mood. He'd been Thorn's fast friend ever since Thorn had healed Mulroon's brother-in-law after an attack by a random clutch of death dogs. Mulroon and the crewman at the oars stayed seated as the jolly boat touched shore and the two travelers climbed aboard. As the boat cleared the shore, Thorn saw ripples just beneath the water's surface, a few body lengths out, pacing the boat.
Since when do the Were act as combat flankers?
Mulroon's people, the Kaskani, were rovers, by land when necessary, but preferably by water. They hailed from a group of rugged islands and ages ago had formed an alliance with the Were, a sleek-furred race who claimed the ocean as their home. Together the two races roamed the whole of the globe and helped bind it together with trade.
Seemed prudent to enlist the Were under the circumstances,
Mulroon replied.
Those damnable dogs tore through Saganak, 3 weeks back, just before the dark of the moon. Left dead and worse behind.
I know. Farron.
In all the chaos was a while afore anyone realized he was missing.
It was me they were after, Thorn said quietly. That's why they took Farron.
Thorn clambered up to his favorite perch atop the main cabin, with his back to the signal mast, where he could enjoy the warmth of the sun. Mulroon called up.
Death dogs been hunting all this while, then? Since Tir Asleen?
Thorn shook his head.
I don't think so. They'd have caught up to us before now.
Beg pardon, shipmaster, Jeren asked. Heard you mention Tir Asleen.
What's that to ya?
Me sergeant back in Bandicourt, he been there. Was part of a triple century of pathfinders sent by the king. Thorn kept his tone casual.
Why did the Angwin king send a force of pathfinders to Tir Asleen?
How should I know? I figure they was looking for Willow.
I beg your pardon, Thorn said.
A Nelwyn sorcerer, don't you know? Willow of Good.
Willow of Good, Thorn repeated. Now, there's a name I haven't heard in a very long time.
Willow of Good. You know him? Damn! Wish I knew him. I bring him to the king, like the proclamation said, me fortune be made. The young Daikini grinned shyly, as though amazed at his own presumption. Get a posting to the Red Lions. Those were the king's household guard, culled from the best troops in royal service, and said to be the finest in all the world.
What's the king want with this Willow? Thorn asked.
Don't you know nothing? The Ascension. This is the celebration of the sacred Princess Elora's 13th birthday. A year of life for each of the great domains. He's her godfather and all, ain't he? Willow saved her from the dark forces. He destroyed the demon queen Bavmorda. He has to be there. "Oh," was what Thorn said. Then, in some amazement of his own, "I'd forgotten." The answer plain as daylight, as impossible to actually see. He could hear the brownies laughing and couldn't fault them for it. He should have known. "The king appears to be going to a lot of trouble," Thorn said then. "That's gospel. Ain't been no celebration like it since the world began, so it's said. Be a sight to behold, all right."
"Your lucky day then, trooper," Mulroon interjected. "You're out of Bandicoot garrison, you say?"
The young man nodded.
"Be just as easy and a lot quicker to take you all the way down to the bay, transfer you to another packet boat that'll take you where you're needful to go. No one will hold it against you for staking yourself to a couple of days' stopover in Anguin, since it's right along the way. You can travel with me as far as Maragway, then I'll pass you on to a captain I trust."
His tone made his dismissal plain. Jaren took the hint and gathered his gear, looking around for somewhere to go. Mulroon called to one of his mates.
"See the lad settled up? Show him the galley in the head. Be off, lad. Make yourself comfortable."
Jaren hurried after the mate. "Bit brusque with the trooper, weren't you?" Thorn wondered a while later in Mulroon's cabin.
"Me nature, don't you know?"
"I was hoping you'd take us the whole way, Jasso." The big man poured himself a mug of steaming tea from a flask on his desk. In return, Thorn rummaged about in the pouch until he came up with the remains of a sandwich. He broke off a chunk for Mulroon, smaller ones for Frangine and Rule, kept what was left for himself.
"You're in a rare mood, Drumheller."
"What's that supposed to mean?"
"No more'n what it says. Don't think I've seen such a humour in you since, hell, I think it was when we first met."
"A dozen years and more."
"Near enough."
"How so, Jasso?"
"You're alive, bucko, top to bottom, in and out. There's a sparkle to your eyes and a passion about you. I tell you true, Thorn Drumheller, that's a sight worth the wait for it."
"Oh, stop."
"I'm talking serious, man. Knowing you since the cataclysm, been like walking with a ghost. Never seen anyone build so strong and high a wall about themselves. Course, ain't seen anyone in such pain, neither. Nor fear."
"It was healing the trooper's horse. Smashed that wall, Jasso. I don't think I ever used so much power before."
"Fair bargain strikes me. You heal the sick, and yourself all at a go."
"Sorsha and Matt Mardigan were my dearest friends. There should have been a way to save them."
"Mayhap was, but you didn't know it is all. No crime in that, Drumheller, not even shame. Be part of the world, Thorn, or find one more suited. Your living friends need you whole."
"Oh, go on."
"There's a scent to the air, Drumheller. A taint to the rivers where they touch Anguin Bay. Trouble's coming. Those damnable hounds are part of it. Everyone with a bit of awareness can sense it. All this damn babble about the Laura Dannon."
Mulroon smiled mirthlessly. "Have you no faith in the sacred princess?"
"She's a girl, nothing more. Spent her whole damn life in that tower the king built her in Anguin. Trot it out when it's convenient for state occasions and the like. She may look the part, Drumheller, good and glorious as spun gold, but I wouldn't count on her to see me through a sunset breeze." In all the world, so Jaren told Thorn with pardonable pride, there was no city finer than Anguin. Off the sunset ocean, you passed through King's Gate between a pair of towering headlands and into an expansive bay. 3 great rivers made their terminus there. Gateway to both land and ocean, Anguin was a natural place to trade. There had been established settlements since the dawn of memory, the Daikini being merely the latest race to plant roots and sink foundations. Anguin was where all the elements came together. Named for the ancient fortress of legend, reputedly situated on the headland across the bay, the city on the southern peninsula benefited from easy access from both land and water. The northern peninsula was a wilder setting where cliffs reared straight up from the water. There were no man-made paths through that wilderness. The folk there, none of them human, liked their privacy and had little interest in the affairs of the hustling, bustling Daikini come lately across the way, which in turn ceded effective control over gate and bay to the sovereign of Anguin, who used that advantage to build a state of unsurpassed wealth and power renowned throughout the Daikini realms. Mulroon placed them in good hands, a blood-kin cousin named Morag, and they had a quick and uneventful journey downriver on a large ocean-capable schooner. But Thorn sensed something was amiss, for he noticed from the moment he came aboard that only a single Wern worked this boat, a young, sleek-furred male named Rin Taxamanyan. And Thorn noted that others of his sea-going kind were increasingly few and far between in the water as they approached the bay. Morag, the schooner's captain, had been a sailor since she was old enough to walk a deck. She knew the bay better than the rooms of her own house, but the absence of the weir, whose natural element was the water, had left her edgy and cautious. "Anyone but Mulroon had asked," she told Thorn. "I'd na ha waited." Sun and sea had textured her skin, which made her emerald eyes gleam all the more brightly. "Myself, Nelwyn, I like a world where things are what they seem." "No less than I, shipmaster." "So where's your girl fall in all this, hey?" she asked him. "She's the stuff of legend. 12 realms, shipmaster, of flesh and spirit, mortal and immortal, all claiming aspects of this life, this globe for their own." Morag thrust her jaw towards the still distant skyline of Anguin. "And yon girl's going to make a difference?" "According to prophecy." Which is fine, assuming that's a contract all the parties feel bound by." He had heard, but he wasn't really listening. His mind was lost in his memories. It was a late night, the eve of the cataclysm, though who was to know it then? The sky was a breathtaking tapestry of stars, and the warm air was leavened by a gentle breeze. The moon was waning as he sat, weary after a day of planting, beneath a shade tree by the house, and glanced up to find the true wizard of the Vale, the High Aldwin, standing before him. "You've not gone to Tir Asleen," the Aldwin said. He meant for Alora Dannon's birthday. "No." "You're godfather to Alora Dannon." "I was husband and father long before." "When you were a farmer, not a wizard." The High Aldwin held up a scrap of cloth. It was frayed all around the edges, like something stripped unfinished from the weaver's loom. As Thorn watched, the threads appeared to tear away, unraveling before his eyes, until all that remained in the Aldwin's hand was empty air. "The fabric of our world no longer holds, young wizard. It wears through, it tears, it ceases to be." What are you saying?" "The farmer has his path, the wizard another. Each offers its joy, each demands a price." "Why are you telling me this? I made my choice." "I know." The Aldwin leaned over to pat his hand. "I just wanted to remind you." With the next night came an explosion in the sky so great that all the village thought the world was done. Thorn knew Tir Asleen was gone, as surely as he knew the fact of his own life. He knew his friends were lost to him, as he knew his family soon would be. The High Aldwin met him at the door. "What's happened?" Thorn said. The Aldwin bowed his head. "I don't know," he confessed. "I was supposed to be there today. I knew the others would understand. I hoped Alora would as well. And I was there. Last night. I was there at Tir Asleen. I thought it was a dream," Thorn said. "I rode there on the back of a dragon." "They represent the greatest of powers, dragons do. To see one, that's the greatest of blessings, or of curses." "I have to go," Thorn said. The old Nelwyn nodded. He held out a hand, a belt with 2 fair-sized pouches attached, Thorn's travelling kit, plus a satchel stuffed with clothes.
The longer you tarry, the greater the danger to all you hold most dear.
Tell my family I love them, Thorn had said.
If they remember nothing else about you, young wizard, that will ever remain.
Damn me eyes, Geron said, breaking his reverie. That column of horses along the shore road, are they who I think?
Aye, Morag told him. Thunder Riders. Mason.
Geron proceeded to show off what he knew. They hail from the plains beyond the stairs to heaven. The stairs to heaven was a phalanx of high, proud peaks, out of which sprang what was said to be the greatest river in the world. In a land of such natural superlatives, it was small wonder the warrior race who claimed it for their birthplace considered none that lived their equals. According to story, Geron continued, they got no proper home. Born on horseback, they live with what they can carry and no more. When the thunder rides, it leaves desolation as its trail, he finished formally. Morag altered course to take the ship further out into the channel before heading for the harbor. She was in no mood to learn the truth of the old saying the hard way. Once they docked, farewells were brief, and Thorn couldn't help noticing that Morag and her husband Shando and the Wern seemed anxious to leave.
Idiot,
Frangine scolded Thorn.
Better you should ask them to take us along.
I have to see how Alora's turned out, Thorn insisted. Whatever the cause of the islanders' apprehension, there was no evidence of it on the quay at Anguin. The crowd was bustling, and there was a tremendous air of celebratory anticipation. Everywhere Thorn turned, somebody was hawking souvenirs. Wow, was all Geron could say as they made their way through the throng. Take some getting used to, Thorn agreed. Been before, have you? Not here, precisely. But I've seen the like, yes. The way I'm looked at, folks hereabouts must think me a proper bumpkin. Pathfinders are a rare sight this deep in country, especially carrying their saddles. They're as old and noble a regiment as the lions, Geron. So you wonder why I've my heart set on t'other? Yes, actually. My granda was a lion. It's a fool's dream, I know, but I thought I could be like him. Perhaps I can help, Thorn said. I'm a Nelwyn. The Magus is a Nelwyn. All you need do is present me at the door. 2 main thoroughfares reached out from the port. The royal promenade ran straight to the city's main landward gate, and the high road beyond. Meandering the other way, along the waterfront towards the King's Gate, was the esplanade, more colloquially referred to as the Rambles, because that was what folk tended to do when the weather was nice, enjoying the spectacular view of the bay. Inland, the highest hill was the King's Mount, of which one of the most impressive features was Elora's Eyrie, sanctum sanctorum of the sacred princess. To some a sanctuary, others a prison, said the roadside troubadour, who provided them with directions. What do you mean, wretch? Demanded Geron. A cage is a cage, my friend, no matter how gilded. Elora isn't allowed out? Thorn asked. Are you daft, drumheller? Geron cried aghast. She's the sacred princess. Likes of her don't mingle with the likes of us. Ain't right nor proper. The Ascension's the first time she'll be seen by any but the royals and her attendants. I'd move off the road if I were you. I beg your pardon? Mason, Thunder Riders. There were no more than a score of these renowned warriors, but their horses' hooves struck the paving stones like drumheads. They were large-framed men, sable figures with horned helmets on ebony horses, as though carved from jet, and presented a stark contrast to the slim figure who led them. She was a woman, for one, not quite a match for them in height, and certainly not in breadth. But she more than made up for that with the sheer force of her personality. She wore no armor and conveyed the sense that none was needed. She was more than capable of taking care of herself without it. She wore 2 daggers on her belt, plus a sword, and her long dark hair hung behind her in a braid. "Anna Carey," the troubadour announced to no one in particular. "Princess Royal, heir apparent since the disappearance of her brother. Been a dozen years since the boy vanished and the queen died. Night of the cataclysm it was, same night the sacred princess was dropped smack dab in the middle of the king's courtyard. There's some who call it a changeling switch, the one for the other, and complain Angwin got the worst of the bargain." "How do you mean?" "The sacred princess didn't do much good for Tir Asleen, did she?" Now that the riders had passed, Thorn saw Jaren striding purposefully through the throng toward a trio of red lions resplendent in their scarlet tabards. Jaren turned and called him. "Drumheller!" "I'm glad to see you found friends, Pathfinder Havelhand." "See," Jaren said triumphantly, an outstretched arm presenting Thorn to the others. "A Nelwyn!" They looked one to the other. They didn't believe. "I am," Thorn told them. "I swear. I believe I can help in your search for the Magus." Another set of looks, and Thorn had a sudden sense of dread that he'd said too much, and all of it wrong. "Right then," one of the lions conceded with a grunt. "Captain'll want to talk with you both." The decision wasn't subject to discussion or resistance. Their captain had been a captain too long, and would remain one until he died. Short on stature, short on wit, he made up for both, with a nose for cheap wine and a belly for bad food.
"Done well, Pathfinder,"
he said to Jaren, who stood at attention.
"I'll be sure to mention it in my report. Leave him in our hands now. We'll see he's taken care of."
"Sir, I thought—"
"Not paid to think, boy. Go."
Jaren went. The captain had fair speed for a man of his bulk. He swept out from behind his desk and rammed Thorn against the wall with a bone-rattling impact.
"Whatever you said to bamboozle that hick won't play here. You're in quicksand, my little man, up to your nose."
He tucked the point of his knife underneath Thorn's jaw and drew blood with a calculated poke. What have I done?" Thorn protested.
"Only one Nelwyn in Angwin, Peck. Only one in the whole world, and that be the Magus. But he warned of an impostor, a blood enemy, he said, of him and the sacred princess."
"Whatever are you talking about?" The captain dug the point in deeper, and blood flowed freely. "Please, I don't understand. Are you talking about Willow Ufgood?"
"The very same, Peck. The Magus wants you alive, and then, unless I'm much mistaken, which I'm not, he wants you damned."
Thorn had been in dungeons before. Didn't like it then, didn't now. The warders had brought their own torches, but bright as they burned, the passage was dominated by a darkness so thick it seemed to swallow the illumination whole.
"Most folks, they've forgotten all about these catacombs,"
the captain chortled.
"Not me, though."
One of the warders held the Nelwyn, while his comrade set to work, clamping the shackles tightly in place. Thorn made no protest. There was no point.
"No more smart-mouth comments, Peck?"
The captain mistook Thorn's silence for fear.
"Got some good news for you. No need to worry about rats or the like coming in the night for a snack. No vermin down here at all is why. Been eaten, you see, by the demon. Stories say these vaults is haunted by a creature so fearsome it'll strip the flesh from your bones and the soul from your body."
With a hollow click, the last fetter snapped closed. Thorn focused on the rapidly fading footsteps with one thought. They're wasting no time clearing out. They truly believe something's down here. The next was the realization that he'd heard no sound of the lock being turned. "Well," Thorn said aloud, just to prove he could both speak and hear.
"Drumheller,"
said Frangine very quietly right beside his ear.
"we do not like this place,"
echoed Rule by the other ear. "Would you pick the lock, please?" Thorn asked. "The manacle's too tight. I can't manage it myself." Rule handled the lockpicks while Frangine watched his back. There was a welcome click. As Thorn had suspected, the warders hadn't bolted the door, and while the hall itself was mostly night, his vision was far more effective upstairs than below. Turning for a moment back to the cell, Thorn was struck with the sense that he was looking at an all-encompassing blackness that went on forever. With a shudder, he stepped across the threshold. Near the top of the step, Thorn took a moment to pull a cloak about himself and the brownies. A passive charm, it made him blend with the background. Anyone who saw him from here on would never give him a second thought. As soon as they reached the outer courtyard, they heard a cry.
You, short fella! Hop to it!
The man was driving a wagon that was part of a convoy of goods that wound its way from the old keep where the supplies came in to the rear of the palace. Because of the cloak, the man mistook Thorn for a serving boy, so Thorn found himself being delivered right to the palace, which was his destination. He found himself in the staffs section of the palace. The windows weren't as big, nor were there as many. The mason stones were square and solid, lacking the gingerbread carvings that decorated the public facade. Doors led off the loading dock. The driver expertly backed his wagon into place, and Thorn saw servants unrolling huge barrels of wine and beer from another wagon in the next stall over. When the driver turned on his seat to look for him, Thorn stepped behind a page and wrapped his cloak a little more tightly about himself. As far as the driver was concerned, the page was the short fellow who'd ridden up with him. He gave orders, and the boy obeyed. Thorn snaked his way through the press of people and into the hall beyond. Along the way, he snatched himself a royal surcoat and a silver serving tray. He found himself in a kitchen, the likes of which he'd never seen. It stretched the whole width of this wing of the palace.
Who are you, then?
Challenged a female voice, and Thorn looked up to see a formidable woman, starched skirts hardly wilting in the ferocious heat. She was covered from collarbone to ankle by an apron, and as she approached, she patted excess flour off her hands.
Sorry, miss, he gabbled. Mean no harm, miss. Here to help. Cart's there, the cook said to him. Through that door, down the hall, up the lift. Apologies for this being a cold sup. If she lays a hand on you, youngster, I'll make it good. Who's it for? The sacred Princess Allura, of course.
Thorn wrestled the cart down the passage he was directed to and emerged into a modest antechamber. As he stood there, the entire room began to rise.
A lift, he murmured delightedly. Brilliant. So glad you think so, groused Frangine. Well, she lives in a tower, my friend. I was wondering how we were supposed to carry this load up to her.
As the lift rose, Thorn was slapped hard by a wave of bitter chill. Not the cold of wind and weather. This struck beyond the flesh, a breath of foulness to coat his soul in rime ice.
Bugger this, growled Rule. Drumheller, I say we go and quickly.
The brownies stood back to back, weapons in hand.
A rookery, Thorn said. Night herons.
Herons were for the air, what death dogs were on foot. The appearance of something living wrapped around a core of rot. But whereas hounds served because they were born to the role, herons did so because it amused them.
Hell's teeth, hissed Rule. Demons in the catacombs, was Frangine's contribution. Night herons in the tower, a wonderful home the sacred princess has made for herself. Considering what happened to her first home, it's not as if she had much choice in the matter, Thorn snapped. Or, he couldn't help adding to himself, friends to stand by her during those awful times. One in particular. I had grief enough of my own, he told himself. Explanation, perhaps, but no longer acceptable as an excuse. She was better off without me. The lift stopped. A door was opened. He heard footsteps. Last time he'd seen her, she'd barely learned to walk, yet her footsteps were as recognizable as his own. He couldn't help the shy and hopeful smile, or the words that popped out of his mouth. Elora Dannon. You call this food? She had a plate from the trolley. You call this a decent meal?
Then she threw it at him. The brownies had better reflexes. They ducked. He didn't. She reached for the condiment jars, and he was decorated with a fair-sized helping of mustard. The brownies took full advantage of the situation to make some mischief, gleefully heaving goo back the way it came, placing Elora in a sudden, unexpectedly fierce crossfire that set her back on her heels. Thorn gratefully made a break for cover, only to discover that the impromptu food fight had made the floor murderously treacherous. He squawked as feet first, then the rest of him went flying. Elora responded by upending a silver tureen of cold soup over his head. The brownies came to his defense, peppering Elora with the smelliest pieces of fish and cheese they could grab. "Guards!" she shrieked. "Vizards! Help me!" Elora had height on Thorn now, standing half again as tall as he, but she had lost none of her baby fat, and put on more besides. Hers was a face more used to sobs than smiles. From hurts Thorn suspected were generally more imagined than real. Her mouth was cast in a perpetual pout. "I hate you! I hate you all! Captain of the Guard!" "Elora, don't!" he protested, wholly in vain as she boxed an ear to shut him up. Anyone else would have received a blow in return, or lesser spell to teach them manners, but he couldn't bring himself to do either. So Frangine, bless him, did it for him. Brownie daggers weren't much longer than rose thorns, but they were much sharper. The thickness of Elora's gown was no protection either, as Frangine's strikes slipped through the layers of finely woven cloth to catch the child full in the backside. Thorn didn't want to leave her, but her screams were sure to attract the attention of her minders. He considered an enchantment to put her to sleep, and cast the events of the past few minutes into the semblance of a dream, but suspected it wouldn't hold on her. Immunity was one of her gifts. Lesser spells rolled off her like water off a duck. "I'm sorry," he said, and then he ran. The brownies led him down so many stairs and around so many corners at such a breakneck pace that he hadn't a clue where he was being led until he burst through a doorway and into a garden, a copse of trees topping a shallow slope. The setting seemed improvised rather than formal, and he knew at once that Elora had designed it herself. He took a step into the open, as quickly ducked back beneath the shelter of the doorway as a great winged shadow swept across the scene. From out another door came Elora, and Thorn actually clutched his heart when the heron dropped down to her. She greeted it with true delight, and it butted its head against her like a true companion. Then both looked toward Thorn's hiding place. One hand raised to point, two mouths opened, two throats uttered an unearthly wail. He hammered open the door behind him and stumbled down another flight of spiral stairs. "Rule! Frangine! Show me the way!"
"They cannot help you, Smalling."
The wall ahead was gone, replaced by a darkness that was absolute.
"Drumheller!"
Rule beckoned from the far end of the corridor.
"You have little time.
"What are you?"
Salvation. They come for you, and they must find you as you were left, else you are lost."
"Frangine, Rule, we have to go." Neither would budge.
"Drumheller,
Rule called.
the Soul Eater. That's a demon."
"You think I don't know that?" he shrieked in the sanctity of his own thoughts, and said out loud, "Get away, foulness! Leave me be!"
"That I cannot do. Hide you may from those who surge above, but only I can deliver you from those below."
The corridor changed around him, and he flinched to behold a horde of Daikini thundering towards him. There was time to make out the captain who'd imprisoned him, and the Princess Anakeri, and a much older man, so tall he had to stoop his head at every doorway. At his heel, unchained and obedient as any puppy, trotted a death dog. An eye blink later, they were on him, ghosts, passing in the night, with only the hound aware something was amiss.
"Decide. There is not time to ask again."
He felt a sharp sting against his thigh, looked down to find Rule beside him.
"It is a Soul Eater, Drumheller. For all our sakes, come away!"
"For all our sakes, Rule, I don't dare!" He heard the brownie cry out as he plunged forward into the darkness. And then he found himself back in the cell.
So, Peck, the tall Daikini said with a smile, what do you have to say for yourself?
The man had ridden beside Anakeri on the esplanade, and Thorn assumed him to be the Mason warlord, their castellan. He played innocent and confused.
My lord, there's been some mistake.
Suddenly he felt the sting of a leather glove across his cheek. Wrong answer, Peck.
Leave him to me, my lord Castellan,
began the captain. Thorn licked his lips, casting his eyes furtively toward the death dog. The hound bared its teeth in a hungry snarl. What's your name? The woman asked.
Thorn Drumheller, lady.
Tell us of Willow.
I'm not sure what milady means.
Willow Ufgood, slayer of the sorceress demon Queen Bavmorda, godfather and sworn protector of the sacred Princess Elora Danan, the Magus. Need I say more?
With all you seem to know, great lady, what need have you of me?
The warlord's stinging glove again. Not a moment for wit, Peck. We are charged, Anakeri said, and Thorn had a sudden flash of insight that she didn't much like Elora, with the defense of the realm and of the sacred princess.
I'm no threat to either.
This is a dangerous time. Never in history have the rulers of all the realms beyond gathered at a human table. Prophecy says the sacred princess is the salvation of the realms, the means by which they might find their way to true and lasting peace, which is why we will allow nothing to disrupt the ceremonies. Why have you come to Anguin?
I thought only to offer service to the sacred Princess Elora as my people had in years past.
The Magus spins a different tale of Nelwynds allied with the darkest of powers. Because of them, Tir Asleen is no more.
That is no truth, lady.
You call the Magus a liar?
I know what I know.
Shall I order the implements of interrogation made ready, dread lord?
Asked the captain. We require answers, dolt, snapped Anakeri. Not a bloodbath. I think, the warlord said, this circumstance requires Milady's special talents. Consider yourself dismissed, Captain, with our thanks for a job well done. The captain scrambled up the stairs, anxious to be away. It was only after he was actually out the door that Thorn realized the death dog was gone as well. Let's get this done, Anakeri said. She had taken some jars from a carryall she'd brought with her and mixed various substances together. Now she dipped 3 fingers into the bowl and turned them clockwise. When she drew them out, sparkles of tiny stars fell from them in a glittery cascade. 2 fingers together, she drew a line across the center of Thorn's forehead, then another bisecting it from the crown of his head to his chin. Where the 2 lines came together, she drew the symbol of an open eye, a magical window to his soul. Next, she outlined his lips to prevent him from holding back any words. After that, the same to his ears, so he'd hear only her words, and to his nose, so she'd have mastery over his very breath. As she worked, each marking on his flesh was replicated on hers. They breathed as one. Their hearts beat as one. He didn't try to fight, partly because he wasn't sure he could. How are you called? The Mason asked softly when she had finished. Thorn Drumheller, was the answer his lips shaped, but the words came from Anakeri's mouth. The questions were simple. Who was he? Where did he come from? Why was he here? He chose his answers with care from that deepest place within him where he still held dominion. They asked of the battle and of the companions he mourned. He let her feel his sense of loss without quite revealing the reasons for it, and was rewarded by a hitch in the smooth rhythm of their breaths, as his pain struck too sharp a resonance in her own memory. He used the break to shore up his own inner defenses without alerting her to the fact that he was actively and fiercely opposing her. He had no sense of the true passage of time, save in the lines of fatigue he saw etching themselves across the Princess Royal's face. His mask was tight across the face of his soul. Every answer had its element of truth, yet the totality was a lie. At long last, she wiped off the star stuff, breaking the link between them. "Well?" prompted the warlord. "A wanderer, no more than what he says he is." "Kill him, then." "It's too close to the ascension. I want no blood spilled. Leave the Nelwyn as he is, Modri, till after the ceremony." "That, Highness, would not be prudent." The warlord stepped forward fast as a striking cobra. Too late, Thorn saw him draw a handful of black crystalline sand from a pouch, watched it coalesce into a slim stiletto blade of gleaming obsidian. Then, with the faintest outrush of breath, he puffed it forward into Thorn's skull, stabbing right through the point where Anna Carey had drawn forth his third eye. As Thorn convulsed, gabbling like a death dog, Anna Carey shoved the man aside with force and fury. "Damn you, Modri! I gave you no such leave." "A good commander knows when to take the initiative, my pet." Of the stiletto there was no sign. The blade and all its malefic power had been absorbed into Thorn's flesh on contact. "Shall we go, Princess?" the Castellan said. "We've indulged ourselves enough for one evening." As she followed, Anna Carey blew on the fingertips of her right hand, then touched them to Thorn's lips, thereby passing on the ghost kiss. And Thorn was alone. This would go on, he knew, until he was pulp and stretched to the full extension between the realms of life and death. It was the same enchantment that had been used on Farron, as too late he realized that Modri had been the sorcerer who'd transformed the boy into the leader of the Great Hunt. But where Thorn was concerned, the change spell would smash his body to rubble, as it would his soul, and rebuild both in the image of a beast, the intellect of a man, the power of a sorcerer, mated to the brute force of a death dog, all tightly leashed to the magus who had cast the spell. Everything in him that hurt, he transformed then into rage, and cast it out his voice. Fire exploded from his breast, lighting him from within, as it followed the byways of his nervous system to the ends of his body. He fought as he had never fought before. He forged a sword from the substance of his soul, but with each swing his blade shone a fraction less brightly, and shadow hemmed him in from every side. The battle would have been soon over had not Anna Carey's farewell kiss cancelled much of her remaining enchantment.
"Trust me,"
he heard, and wished he was deaf. "You're a demon!" he shrieked in his mind.
"You won't die. They won't let you. They've caught you good and proper, and through you, the child. Can't save yourself, Peck. How are you to save her?"
He didn't have long. Even if he survived through some miracle, all that remained of him would be a shell. "Help me," he asked. "Please." In a twinkling, his insight expanded beyond its farthest boundaries. He was stone, every stone, from the core foundation to the highest roof point, and he beheld the dungeon where he lay and every other room of the palace as well. Suddenly, he was looking at the brownies from a score of different directions and hearing their voices, big as life. "Told you! Told you!" Frangine had worked himself into a state. They were both still in Alora's tower and had taken refuge in the central tree of the garden there. "He's been eaten by a demon and we are stuck." The brownie had it right and wrong. Thorn was as much the demon now as he was an eagle when insight allowed him to ride his soul with Anella's, and the experience was as much a wonder. Then his vision shifted, and Thorn saw Elora in her room, being tended by people who feared and disliked her. All were proud to have her in residence. None wanted the slightest thing to do with her. He opened his eyes, grateful at last for a purely physical sensation, and felt stone beneath his cheek. He was sore all over, but the aches were little more than what came after a poor night's sleep. He pushed himself up. "Who are you?" Thorn wondered aloud. "What are you?"
I am. How I came to be, I do not know. I have always been of this place.
I must go, Thorn said, but failed in his initial attempt to rise.
You cannot. There is a debt. Honor demands a settlement.
I was wondering when we'd get around to that. The darkness moved, and Thorn saw all his possessions before him, including his sword. You have been busy, he said to the demon as he buckled on his belt and pouches. There was no reply. When he looked up, a woman lay before him. She floated at waist height. She was tall and powerfully built, with broad shoulders, long arms and legs. Her hair was black as the darkness surrounding her and cropped close to the skull. Tribal tattoos on bicep and thigh, plus some scars. A nose that had been broken, set between wide-set eyes and high cheekbones. She had the upturned eyes and gold-touched skin of one who hailed from the Spice Lands, and the tone of her musculature spoke of a woman who earned her way with a sword. She didn't breathe, but she wasn't dead. There was a smudge on the center of her forehead, as he knew there was on his, where the crystal blade had been thrust home. Same fate, same fight, and in her way, she'd won. She'd preserved her soul and her humanity, though it had cost her every other aspect of herself. Who was she?
She fled from those who would enslave her.
What is it you want?
Freedom for my child.
No, he said. I cannot, I will not. That is an abomination.
Does not the one gift balance the other?
She had a life and being all her own. You had no right to steal it.
Both life and being are gone. Wherein is the harm in using what remains?
Even if that were true, there's no way I'd be mad enough to loose a demon from its prison.
I offer you my greatest treasure, to shape and do with as you will. If there is a better way of living than we have ever known, teach it to my child.
I've never heard one of you talking so. Why should you care?
I had no regard for those of your kind about me until the youngling in the tower came. I was special to her. She called me friend. At first I answered because it amused me. Then she spun a spell of words and brought light where none had ever shone. It was more than I could bear. To my shame and sorrow, I fled from her. But having beheld the light, even if only for that moment, I cannot bear to keep my child in the dark.
I should have come sooner, Thorn breathed. Past his mind's eye cascaded a series of images of a child whose spirit was as radiant as her flame-blonde hair, cast into a land of strangers to become an object of veneration and fear, a talisman, not a needing, growing girl. Yet for all that, she made a garden of such peace that even night herons couldn't befoul it. And here was a demon speaking of hope, bargaining to give its offspring a better life. The faintest of gleams on the floor caught Thorn's eye, and he took up Anakeri's silver hair clip. His insight saw the face of a blond boy, Anakeri's lost twin, and he knew that this had been a last gift on their shared birthday before their world shattered. The princess loved few things more, so how, he wondered, had it come to be left behind? Perhaps there's hope after all, he whispered.
Your answer, Thorn Drumheller.
If it's within my power, I'll save your child. To do what was necessary required that Thorn bind himself to the demon, in much the same way that Anakari had bound herself to him. In the process, while his sorceress abilities expanded exponentially, his hold on them became increasingly tenuous. Anytime his concentration shifted slightly from the task at hand, his perspective shattered, and scenes from all over the palace pierced him, seemingly at random. He was swept helplessly to the top of Alora's eyrie. At precisely the stroke of midnight on the last night of Alora's 12th year, the Vizards come for her. They are her keepers, charged on peril of life and soul across the 12 domains with her protection. One representative from each realm, rotated each year, so that on this special day there will be 12 sets of 12 to stand by her. He was swept helplessly to the apartments of the Princess Anakari. She stands on the wraparound balcony of her rooms and stares up at Alora's eyrie. "It's an honor," he hears the king say, and realizes that both voice and scene are part of Anakari's memory. A mask lies between father and daughter on a silken pillow. It is a thing of beauty, a human face, interpreted by the finest artisans of the Vale folk. "I don't want it. I am a princess." "I don't ask you to understand, Anakari, nor approve. I do require your obedience." She will wear the mask and attend Alora as Vizard for her allotted month. Instead, she flees. The images of Anakari lasted until she passed beyond the palace walls. They were the limits of the demon's range. The scene again shifted. Alora isn't in her room. And in that moment, Thorn was gripped by the wild fear that she had fled her fate as well. But the Vizards don't need much of a search to find her. She isn't trying to hide. She has simply exchanged bed for garden and nestled herself in the crook of an oak branch. Thorn couldn't help a smile at the sight. He hears the sound of wings manifesting in the form of a human child, standing in the door of a private sitting room. Boy or girl, it is hard to tell. "You are not what we expected, Kirin Denier," says a voice. Consort to a Vale Lord, the woman, like all her race, is very tall. "Be glad I've come at all. Do not be impertinent to me. I am Queen Magister of the realms beyond. I stand second among the assembly to Sherlindria herself. And I am as my brethren would have our hosts see us, complete with Daikini name to match their features. You are but a single aspect of the Vale folk. We are of earth and air and fire and water. We come to this assembly in friendship. You are too trusting. Your power has made you arrogant. Perhaps, but none of us shall break the peace we all swore upon Alora Dannon's birth. What will happen when the Daikini have that accursed brat to stand as their champion? According to prophecy, Alora Dannon is to stand champion for us all. The cataclysm manifested itself in every domain. Only Alora Dannon survived. Whatever struck at her, lady, is a power to be reckoned with." "They're afraid," Thorn whispered, and the sound of his own voice broke the cord that linked him to the Vale Queen's apartment. From every turret of the palace, a trumpet voluntary burst forth, reaching out across city and bay. Sunrise. Where had the night gone?
"You wander."
There was accusation in the demon's voice. "I know, I'm sorry." The figure of the woman still floated before him. Thorn reached out to the woman's forehead and found the flesh cool to the touch. He touched fingertips to his own brow, then lips, lastly heart. He ran a line from her forehead to her lips, her heart, and beyond, marking all the crucial access points of power in her body. He blew a puff of air into her mouth. He drew a breath as deep as he could manage, and felt her chest expand to follow.
The form lives. It breathes.
I live, demon, I breathe. She lives because I sustain her. What of the Magus? What of Alora Dannon? Elora stands now in her room, having been wrapped so tightly in layers of ceremonial clothes that she can't even sit. She wonders if the Vizards will have to carry her to her altar. It was as though Thorn's eyes had turned to prisms, each the window on a different scene. Anna crosses to the stables with leonine strides. The lions are to ride today in full ceremonial regalia. Anna has defied her father again, exclaiming, "I am Colonel Commander of the Red Lions. My place is with my troops." "Jalabi," she calls now to her adjutant. "Dread Lady," he calls back. "Don't call me that. I've told you 1,000 times. Highness will do." It's an old joke between them. "I want a change in regimental orders for today." "Lady?" "I want them riding with war lances and shields." "Not very trusting by nature, are you?" Modri's voice brings a surprisingly shy smile to Anna lips. "No more than you would be, Modri, in similar circumstances." "This is a day of celebration, Princess, yet I note you've confined my personal escort to barracks, with a full troop of your own to mind them. My dear Anna I hardly think you've anything to fear from a score of them." "I've seen them fight." "And fought beside them." He takes her hand gently in his. "You should have stayed. You are one of us." "These are my people. This is my home." "You left once." "And came back." They cross the Ares shadow, and the Castellan stops, his head cocked. "Impossible. The prisoner." "What of him?" "I had this sense of being watched." "He knows," Thorn said.
All the more reason, little Magus, for you to focus on the task at hand.
A pain lanced up from deep within, as if some power had snapped him in two. He saw the thread of his soul as he watched. A darker strand reached out to embrace it. In desperation, his spirit form lunged forward to grab his soul and hold it fast. It shattered. He howled. The second pain was greater than the first. The third spasm broke his consciousness. He knew there'd be another spasm, and another. It would go on, until the demon's child was delivered, or he ceased to be. Time passed. He lost all sense of it, until, at long last, he drew back to himself a sense of self. "I am," followed by, "I am Thorn Drumheller." Shard by shard he found himself. Then he felt another vibration trickle through the fabric of the stones. New enchantments casting resonances off powers long dormant, as they had not been for longer than the memory of man. "Fools!" he cried within his thoughts. "Fools! What are you doing up there in the great hall?" He heard a final fanfare. It was precisely the moment of sunset. Thorn feels the doors of Alora's great hall thrown open. The space is alight with a multitude of candles. Interlaced around the chamber's circumference are the great seals of the domains, with Alora's own as the centerpiece. Between each set of seals is a section of seats for that domain. The vizards enter first, with solemn, stately tread. Next come the rulers of the domains, sovereigns of the primal elements, earth and air and fire and water, and of the primal mysteries. Some appear human, because that is their true nature. Others do so out of courtesy. A few make not the slightest pretense. 2 sections remain empty at the head of the room. Then, to all appearances, the candle flames begin to dance. Tiny spots of light and color form ever more intricate patterns with the streamers left in their wake. All eyes turn toward the doorway. The fairies average the size of a human finger. Their queen dwarfs them, though she stands smaller than a Daikini child. Sherlindria's hair is gossamer gold, so pale it nearly matches the silver of her gown. Her wings are scarcely thicker than its diaphanous fabric. Seeming to float, she makes her way along the aisle, Angwin's king proudly, handsomely by her side. Her companions form behind her, creating the illusion of a vast, glittering train. It is a breathtaking display. When she takes her seat, it shatters, all its fairy parts spinning off like plasma from a newborn star. When the room quiets and eyes grow once more accustomed to the less dramatic illumination of the candle glow, Thorn beholds Willow Offgood standing in the doorway. Through the demon's eyes, Thorn beheld the most magnificent lie. The figure is tall, in a way Willow has never been, and handsome, in a way Willow never dreamed of being. In the main, the features are his, but they've been polished to push him more toward what the Daikini would consider craggy good looks. Gold thread is worked through the fabric of his garments, catching the light with every movement. As Willow's stride eats up the distance from entrance to altar, Thorn has an absurd vision of dust motes scrambling to get out of his way. Thorn can't watch, can't bear to, and yet cannot tear his eyes away. This false Willow is too splendid a glory for any living being, mortal or otherwise, to resist. Were he himself, he would be lost. Fortunately, the demon discerns the patterns. It is the simplest kind of glamour, used by touring conjurers to place their audience in a more receptive mood, and easily deflected by any sorcerer worth the name. Yet the web being woven here is such a masterpiece of deception that simply to behold this deceiver, Thorn decides in that instant that deceiver is the name he'll use from now on, is to become ensnared. He felt something slip within him, as though from his grasp, and made a frantic scramble to regain his hold. It was the demon's child. He was losing it. He embraced the demon, full-hearted and with all his strength, and in that dreadful moment became the demon. The delicate strands of the deceiver's glamour wind through the assemblage in the great hall. Thorn cast himself toward the doorway of the great hall. Hands not hands slipped again, and Thorn hesitated, torn between two demands of equal weight, Elora's on the one hand, and the demon child's on the other. The doors begin to open. He knows as certainly as he knows anything that Elora is doomed if she steps inside that chamber. It was no choice, really. He cleaved himself child from demon, and then did the same again to cast the demon from himself. He bent over the woman's body, his lips to hers, and let his spirit pass over to all the hollow places within her. Her lips moved beneath his. There were tears in his eyes, in hers. "It's all right," he tried to say. "You're all right, you're safe." But the words wouldn't come, because for all his efforts, he wasn't yet sure they were true. "Bastards!" he heard someone shout, and he turned to see Jaren Havelhand, double-handed broadsword shaking in his grasp. Face upturned to the palace above, Jaren cried, "Bastards! They're killing the lions!" He rushed down the stairs. "Cut 'em down like butchers, them and their damn birds!" "Oh, the herons!" "Drumheller, what's happening? What does it mean?" "Nothing good, I fear. Has anyone sounded the alarm?" "None left of ours to try. Only reason I'm still alive is I ran into the old keep. Oh, forgive me, Peck. I didn't know this is what they did with you. I thought they'd treat you better." "Make amends when you can, lad. Now's not the time. See to the lady here." The young Daikini flushed to the roots of his hair. "Blessed Elora! She's got no clothes." "Then find her some, and quickly. Horses, too. I have other responsibilities. Trust me in this, and be careful." "And you the same?" Jaren turned to the woman. "Got yourself a name, missy?" Thorn didn't expect a reply. "Corey," she said, her voice roughened by an age of unuse. "Corey Bannaphon." "Jaren Havelhand. A pleasure." "Demon!" Thorn made the word a summons.
You've done well, little mage. Speak to the stones. They will make way for you.
He reached out to the stones, requesting safe passage. As they answered him, he felt within them their response to the sound of another fanfare, and the moon rise. Both moments made Elora tremble, and through the double bond that made Thorn part of both demon and castle, it was as though he stood by her side. The doors swing wide. Elora knows the face that waits on the dais, though her whole life has passed since she saw it last, and when his arms open wide to receive her, she remembers how warm and safe she always felt in his embrace. "Elora Dannon," she hears him say, "in the name of the 12 domains, I bid you welcome." A shallow ramp leads her around the circumference of the central dais, past each of the assembled domains. As she makes her circuit, she glances across the front rank of chairs. One section of seats is virtually empty. Only one figure, a boy, or possibly a girl, she can't really tell, sits alone, resplendent in an iridescent suit. He seems to her to fill the entire space, to the point where she has a sense of great wings folded over a sinuously majestic body that reaches all the way to the ceiling. "A shaper," she breathes. "By all the blessed, a dragon." Everyone else present, she notes, is joined by delicate strands of gold and glitter, which leap toward her as she passes each row in turn, only to fizzle as they come near her. The boy is also untouched. The apex of the domed roof is a skylight displaying the seals of the 12 domains, interwoven to form that of the fabled, long-hoped-for 13th. Her domain. As the skylight catches and intensifies the moon glow, the room turns silver. This light has a weight, a presence that she doesn't like. It illuminates all the secret places within her, and it hurts. She thinks she says something, is sure she hears a voice that strangely resembles her own, but only Willow is speaking in the formality of phrase the ceremony demands. All is silver. She is silver, her figure stiffening within as her costume imprisons her without. Earlier in the ceremony, she thought herself a statue in all her layers of clothing. Now, she is becoming one in fact, and terror washes across her. "No," she says, not realizing she speaks aloud. That small, simple word casting a spear into the heart of the complex construct of power Willow is building about her. He doesn't believe his ears. He stumbles over the next phrase, has to repeat himself, and there's nothing friendly any longer in his eyes as he wills her to be silent. "No!" Streamers of silver fire swirl about the dais, cast down from the skylight to the floor, ringing her like the burning bars of a cage. "No!" she cries. She throws her hand forward, palm first, to bat away the flames. Mistake. Being of the moon, they cast a fire that is cold, but inflicts no less intense a burn. With a scream, Elora snatches her hand back and cradles it against her breast. Then she tucks her head and kicks forward through the flames. She has an awful sense of clothes burning, hair burning. And then she's clear. She plows into Willow and knocks him from his perch, and they tumble from the dais. "Selfish, headstrong, bloody little cow!" her godfather and protector squalls. He takes her by the front of her smoldering gown, about to pitch her back toward the flames. "You'll ruin everything!" "Why?" she sobs. "For a world that must never be."
The sacrifice of one for the salvation of all.
"You heard Elora Dannon, deceiver," says a new voice, seemingly from nowhere. "Leave her alone." To Elora, thorns seemed to pop up from solid stone. He struck Willow behind the knee, and when the taller figure staggered, boxed both his ears to force him to release the girl, then heaved the deceiver into the conflagration. He went in. He didn't come out the other side. "Elora Dannon," Thorn said. I know you," she replied in some confusion. "I'm a friend. I'm here to help you."
Little knowing fool! You've done more harm than you can know!
The column of fire was gone, and with it all semblance of Willow Upgood's humanity. The face and the form hadn't changed in basic shape, but flame had taken the place of flesh, and Thorn thought that he'd come face to face with yet another demon.
And now you'll pay the price!
A bolt of withering flame struck, corroding stone to powder. It would have done the same to Thorn himself had he not dived aside and yanked Elora with him. He looked for the portal through which he'd arrived, but saw it sealed by the same attack. Thorn addressed the cheering crowd. "Elora is betrayed!"
A wasted effort, Peck. They see what they believe is Elora
ascendant. They no more hear you than the child. I am salvation, not her.
Despite himself, Thorn had to look, drawn by a force of command that was as irresistible an attraction as those which held the world together. The voice was water to a thirsty man, love to one who'd never known it before. Step by step, he made his way towards the embrace of oblivion, eyes only for the glory before him, as the deceiver, of necessity, had eyes only for him. Neither was aware of any other presence until Elora blindsided Thorn like a charging ram and sent the pair of them crashing off the dais to the feet of Kirin Denier. "You'd better go," said the child. "Things here, I suspect, are about to turn very nasty." He stood, catching the deceiver's next attack full in the chest, while his human guise peeled away before the burning onslaught. Kirin's flesh stretched high and wide, clawed forelimbs, gouging scars in the stone as his towering head brushed the ceiling. A single sweep of his wings could generate a wind capable of tearing full-grown oaks from the ground. What they thought was costume stood revealed as his magnificent, iridescent skin. Down every aisle came the Vizard's halberds leveled, and Thorn covered Elora's body with his own as the dragon struck out with head and tail and dashed a double score of figures aside, clearing a path for them to the main entrance. Unfortunately, the deceiver wasn't about to let them go that easily. Thorn heard a volley of words flung after them. Ice slapped Thorn in the face, the flames freezing every bit of moisture in the air and casting them in a hurricane vortex that made them as vicious as tiny blades. Elora screamed. Her eyes blazed with the same awful fire as the figure on the dais, her arms outstretched as her body was drawn up on tiptoe. Thorn knew at once what was happening. The deceiver had summoned the powers with his spell and was channeling them through Elora. Energy so raw and primal it burned his eyes to behold it, exploded from her. The deceiver's attacks turned to the dragon, who made no effort to deflect them as they ripped into him, each plunging deep as a spear. As fast as the deceiver poured his infernal energies into Elora, Kirin drew them into himself. The dragon's great head snapped forward, and honest scarlet flame leapt forth to counter the lunar cold. Now, at long last, it was the deceiver who was put on the defensive. For the briefest of moments, he was enveloped in the glare of the dragon's breath, but a lance of incandescence burned the air between the deceiver's outstretched arms and the dragon's breast, and a light burst within the huge creature. Then, almost all turned to silver. Kirin turned his gaze on the deceiver with a look as full of compassion as sorrow. Kirin Denier fell with a crash that shook the tower to its foundations. As the dragon collapsed, it took with it whatever remained of the power that had manifested through Elora, so she collapsed as well. Thorn had at best a few seconds to act. He settled Elora in his arms, placed his right hand on the flagstone floor, and spoke to the stones. Then he simply dove in, as though the stone were a pool of water. Hands caught them on either side. "Blessed bride," said Jeren. "Where'd you come from?" Thorn saw frost on every exhalation. His eyes followed the hand on his arm up to Corey's face. Jeren had been true to his word and had found her a decent set of clothes. "Why is it so cold?" he asked as they hurried along a passage. Corey tapped his arm and pointed. Elora's eyrie burned. The magical blaze extended down the column, and the flames wouldn't stop when they reached the bottom, Thorn knew. As within her hall, these eldritch flames didn't give off warmth. They absorbed it. Jeren had a quartet of Daikini war horses standing nervously at hand, more than ready to run. The main thoroughfares were blocked, so Jeren found them a roundabout route to the King's Gate. Thorn thought the streets would be thick with people fleeing the fire, but while they encountered a fair number, it was nowhere near what he'd expected. It was as if the whole city understood that it was doomed. The animals, however, were fleeing. Thorn saw cats and dogs, household pets, and beasts of burden, vermin of every description, horses, mules, sheep, and cattle. Thorn's small party found their first body just inside the gatehouse. Anakeri's Sergeant Major Jalabi had managed to draw his sword against his attackers, and had obviously given a fair account of himself. Thorn looked past Jalabi's sightless eyes, wishing there was a way to wipe the shame of failure that was the last image imprinted on the old soldier's soul. He heard the hiss of steel slicing air, and turned to see Corey wielding the man's sword as though it had been made for her. He took a lesser blade from the dead man's other hand. "With your blessing, old campaigner, I ask this boon. A chance to set things right," he said. Outside there was an eerie stillness at the gate, as countless eyes, none of them human, turned to Thorn in mute expectation. The animals scuttled to clear a path for him. "Drumheller!" called Corey from atop the wall, which made him stare in dumbfounded astonishment. How did she get herself all the way up there? "Riders from the land, coming fast!" Thorn slashed his blade across his palm, coating its edge with blood, then slapped the crossbar that locked the looming double doors of the gate. A link established between the three key elements, himself, the blade, the target. He marshaled his will, giving full vent to all his grief and fury. The sound of Thorn's voice echoed across the plaza, and the doors blew off their mountings. Beyond, the Mason riders were thrown by the titanic shock wave. Horses fled in panic. Only Anna Carey remained the mistress of her mount. But it did her no good, as the animals that thronged the inner plaza took full advantage of the way to freedom. Thorn and his companions were seen, but the Mason hadn't a prayer of stopping them. They simply couldn't be reached through that awesome stampede.
"By the abyss,"
she heard Modri say.
"It's stopped,"
he said. "What?"
"See for yourself, Highness. The flames reached the city walls and stopped. They've gone no further."
She lifted herself on her stirrups. There were no more flames, yet everything before her glowed like ice and diamonds.
"You should have left the peck to me," Modri said. "If you hadn't joined me for an inspection of my encampment beyond the walls."
Anna Carey kept a firm grip on her emotions. She had lost everything, and both knew it. "3 horses," she said. 4 riders, 2 men, 2 women, 1 man in royal Angwin colors, 1 Nelwyn. I don't know the man. I don't know the woman. But before her, on her saddle, rode the one who called himself Drumheller. She carried Jalabi's sword. The girl was Alora Dannon. I want them, Modri." It was a crisp, clear night, and stars should have filled the sky. But only the brightest now could be seen from the crest of the ridge line, where the foursome had wearily dismounted. "Never seen any fire cast up such a shine," Jaren said. "Damnation, Peck, what the hell happened? Are they all dead in Angwin, d'ye think?" "Anna Carey's free," Thorn noted, rolling her silver hair clip between his fingers. Jaren nodded. "Aye." "Who are you?" challenged a girl's voice, and the 2 men turned to the bedroll where Alora Dannon lay. She gleamed like she'd just come from the jewelsmith. All the gold was gone from her hair as well. If anything, it had turned more pale than her skin. "You're safe with us, Elora." "I know you!" He smiled, thinking of the baby who used to burble happily when he held her. "You're the Peck who attacked me! Guards! Vizards!" "Oh, there's none about but us, girl," said Jaren, who hadn't yet twigged to her true identity. "I am no girl, wretch! I am the sacred Princess Elora Dannon." "Oh, bless my soul!" Jaren was on his knees before he finished speaking. "Don't you remember?" Thorn demanded of Elora. "You never told me, Peck. Stealing the sacred princess, are you mad?" "Your precious Ares gone, Elora," Thorn said with flat brutality. "And the king's city with it, and the rulers of the 12 domains." "Liar!" And she caught Thorn across the face with her fist. "You don't know me? From the tower! You and those 2 awful little—" her mouth twisted in disgust. "Bug men! The spell of assumption. Do you remember the flames? The creature who pretended to be Willow?" "You lie! Willow Offgood is my protector." "It's not surprising that you don't remember. The spell of assumption guts a person's soul. It burns from you all that you were, every memory, every aspect of self, leaving you a hollow and wholly empty vessel." She ignored him and turned to Jeren. "You! I want to go home. You take me." "Beg pardon, Most Serene Highness, but I got to tell you, the horses can't handle that ride. Besides, the peck's right. Angwin's cursed." "I hate you both!" And with that, Elora collapsed on her bedroll in tears. The following morning, the escarpment was dusted with snow. Elora was still outraged, and Thorn could find no sign of the Pathfinder, only Corey, huddled snug under the ridgeline, where an umbrella of rock provided a sort of refuge. The thump of hooves, the jingle of a bridle, announced the Pathfinder's return. Turned out that was true, only not quite the way Thorn assumed. The young man's bound and battered body was pitched over the crest to skid downslope to Thorn's feet. A stranger rode his horse. A half-score of bravos lined the ridge, hefting weapons. "Fortune's made, boys," the rider announced. "We're all rich men, sure." The air inside the roadside alehouse where they were taken, bound and gagged, was thick with smoke and the stench of unwashed bodies. One of the bravos shoved Corey into a corner where she sank to a loose-limbed seat on the floor. Elora they gave a wide berth to. She, of course, was furious and told the men so in no uncertain terms. They turned out to be less patient than Thorn, slapping in place a leather mask that covered the whole of her head. A broad belt went around her waist, and she was shackled to a ring bolt on the wall. They hog-tied Jeren. As for Thorn, a neck collar was fastened to yet another ring bolt, and his hands were tied behind his back. He busied himself persuading his bonds they'd be much more fulfilled undone.
"Maybe she's a magic,"
posed one of the men, tossing a thumb to where Elora sat in an awkward huddle.
"Not just silver to look at, I'm saying, but the real thing through and through."
So what if she is?
Asked another, burping the foam off his beer.
"Worth a lot more then, I'm thinking, than what's been offered."
"You're a daft bugger, Mallow,"
said the leader, whose name was Simya. Mallow was sidling glances towards Corey, not bothering to mask the thoughts behind them.
"If and I don't harm the bitch Simya, who's to object to me having a bit of fun with her, eh?"
Simya simply waved a hand in acquiescence. The Daikini swaggered the length of the bar to the cheers of his fellows, even Simya joining in by hauling Corey to her feet. Mallow put his lips on hers. It was a long kiss. Through it all, Corey reacted not a bit. Jeren's voice broke through the din. "Leave her be, damn ya!" One of the bravos minding him poked his broken ribs, and the Pathfinder twisted in agony. That was all the motivation Mallow needed. He gave Jeren a leer in return and hustled Corey past the bar to the cubicles beyond. But just as they were about to enter, she turned and took him in a splendid high kick in the bridge of the nose. He staggered backwards, blood spurting as if he'd been poleaxed. As he collapsed, she grabbed up a broad-headed mallet used to hammer spigots into beer barrels. The first man to follow caught a short jab to the head, the next a full-fledged swing that doubled him over. Thorn yanked his hands free the moment Corey made her move, tearing open the buckle of his collar and dropping flat to the floor as the nearest thug made a lunge for him. When the Daikini landed, Thorn clamped the collar around his neck, one down. He scooped some powder from his pouch and puffed it toward the men watching Jeren. Each tiny dust mote was instantly imbued with manic life and the combined properties of a burr and a very hot coal. By the time Thorn reached Jeren, the Daikini were hopping like madmen, slapping at itching little horrors they could barely see. Then, the ceiling fell in, and Rin Taxamanyan crashed among them. The Wern landed beside Simya, and before the big man could react, scooped his legs out from under him and dropped him with force enough to shake the floor. Rin had claws, but he preferred knives, 3 in each hand, held between clenched and folded fingers, and used them with madcap abandon. Never to draw blood. Thorn saw that from the start. Most of the wounds that followed came from one thug striking another by mistake. Thorn called Corey to help with Jeren and hurried to Elora, wincing as something hot flicked the back of his neck. At first he thought he'd run into one of his own mites, but a glance upwards told him the situation was far more serious. A torch had ignited the roof, and even though the outside air was damp with falling snow, the bulk of the thatch was tinder dry. He freed Elora from the wall and cast about for an exit. Rin popped up to point the way. They hustled out the door to the horses their Wern deliverer had brought, just as the lodgepole collapsed, pulling the bulk of a wall along with it. They were well into the trees, along a trail used mostly by woodland creatures, when Rin pulled Elora's gag free. Her eyes went wide at Rin's furry face as he placed a hand over her face to silence her, a finger on his lips. Thorn expected a tantrum, but she surprised him with a twitch at the corner of her mouth that might have been the beginnings of a legitimate smile, an expression he'd seen before when a fairy had danced on the baby Elora's nose. So, he thought, the world's still a wonder to you, child. Might be some hope for you yet. I'm a friend, Rin told Elora, looking her straight in the eyes, although his words were for them all. And we're thankful for it, Thorn replied. I know you from the riverboat, exclaimed Jeren to Rin as they rode through the night. The Wern nodded and answered Thorn's unspoken query. Morag put me ashore, had a dream, cast a looker to see what's what. A looker was a prescient trance. They made fair time. Rin had a knack for finding the easiest, quickest pathways through the forest, but that didn't always mean he'd follow them. If a trail was natural to him, it could be the same for any in pursuit. Finally, he found them a place to rest just within the tree line, and Thorn was able to gentle Jeren's broken ribs back into place. But there was no time for the Pathfinder or anyone else to recoup their lost strength, for Thorn felt a trembling to the ground. A puff of his powder made a tiny puddle before him into a scrying pool, a window through which inside could show him virtually any place in the realms. The sight made him gasp aloud. Rin, Morag's waiting to pick you up again? Yes, why? The Thunder Riders are coming from the south. Not just men and hounds, seekers from the Vale folk. If we stay on land, we're done. The wind on the bay side of the peninsula's central spine was cold and hard, as though it came straight off an ice cap. Only a fool sets sail in weather like this when she don't have to, Morag grumbled. Believe me, if there was an alternative. Thorn's eyes turned north, as though he could see through the lowering cloud base and perhaps even the glow of cursed Angwin. Morag's mate and husband Shando called, Hatches triple battened, Morag. We're as ready as we'll ever be. I offer no guarantees, Drumheller. Not on a day like this, with storms blowing out of nowheres, Morag said. A swell pushed the ship clear of shore, and they were off. Following the others in his party, Thorn was on the steps to the cabin below when the ship fully cleared the breakwater, and they got their first taste of what lay beyond. The swells began to strike the hull like solid objects, shaking the schooner along its whole length. In the cabin, Elora and Jeren sat together, the Pathfinder doing his best to shield her, Elora shivering and sobbing. They were all bitterly cold. Morag came down the hatchway. You! She jabbed a thumb at Rin, then at Corey. Time you made yourselves useful. Clear the bilge as hard as you can. Drumheller, on deck. The wind lashed at him with such force that he could only moderate its effect on himself. There was no way to spare the others or the boat. Morag put her lips to his ear and bellowed, Can you help? It's the wind and sea. Natural forces. Nothing magical. What I feared. Can't cut across the face of the storm. Our only hope's to run before it. That would take them back the way they'd come, towards Angwin. Shando pointed from the wheel. See there, the glow! Too big for the lighthouse! Angwin, I'm thinking, Drumheller, said Morag. We don't want to go there! The buildings were ablaze still, glowing silver from within. Ice had been spun into gossamer spiderwebs that linked every structure, and, Thorn suspected, every being within the city walls, transforming the metropolis into a confection so delicate the slightest tap with a hammer would shatter it to dust. Rin's head popped up the companionway steps. Grubhiller! Elora Dunnan is gone! There! Shando pointed to a figure clambering awkwardly up the forward companionway, making her way around the foremast until she was in front, with her back plastered to it.
Bleeding bloody hell!
Morag snarled as Rin levered himself into view and plunged recklessly toward Elora. I am the sacred Princess Elora Danan, the child called against the gale. It is my destiny to rule the 13 realms. It is your duty to obey. Wind and waves, hear me. I command you to be still. She was hardly wider than the mast itself, a scarecrow in tattered finery. Yet she called the storm to silence, and for that first wondrous moment, Thorn thought that, by sheer gall, she had pulled it off. Suddenly, the scene was gripped by an active silence. They reached the crest of the wave, and the mystery was broken by a hollow wail from Shando.
Oh my God!
The moment was frozen, as though the world itself had been crystallized like anger. They crested the wave, a higher, steeper climb than any previous. Only this time, there was no slope to negotiate on the far side. Instead, a sheer drop, as though they'd come to the edge of a cliff.
Hold on!
Thorn heard Morag cry just before they struck. He grabbed for the nearest handhold as the deck tilted vertical, saw water on every side as the bow plunged into the trough. Arms gathered about him, Morag using her body to shield his as best she could. The mainmast snapped like a twig, wrapping the hull in a tangle of massive splinters, tearing sails and cordage. In another instant, they were underwater, the world still rolling all about him as the riptides within the wave tried to yank him free. He felt Morag slip, lunged for her, but couldn't find any decent purchase. She was hurled against the aft companionway like a broken rag doll, then dropped into the cabin. Hatches and portholes gave way under the tremendous impact, water bursting into the cabin, solid wood visibly flexing like sheets of tin. He didn't know how he survived, knew even less how the ship managed, but that was what happened. "We're alive," he said aloud. It was Jeren who found Morag. The men had to hurt her, bringing her onto the deck. She was broken in too many places for them not to, but she didn't make a sound.
My wife needs you, wizard,
Shando said. Thorn wiped her face clear of blood, feeling the crack to the skull just beyond her hairline. She spoke with a pinch of her normal asperity. "Where away are we?" He could feel Angwin's infernal chill burning into his back. Ahead, beyond the next wave, was the breakwater that formed a barrier to the great bay. "Due off the headland." "The main current stays without. The wind pushes us in," Morag said. "We have to stay with the current." He saw what had to be done and shook his head. "There must be another way. The schooner won't hold together." "What, Thorn?" she muttered impatiently. "Can I save my boat and save me? You wee damn daft bugger. If you don't save the boat, there's no point what you try with me." The danger was that Thorn's display of power would mark their position as surely as any beacon, but the risk had to be taken. He cast ahead for the course that would carry them past Angwin. "Doing well, little wizard," Morag said. He started to offer some of his strength to her, telling himself it wasn't too late. "No, you have precious little strength left, none at all to spare for me." "We have a problem." Rin, his fur plastered to his skin, came up to him, leading Elora on a tether. The child was apparently unhurt, but her face slack with shock. "I think we're taking in water. The bow isn't coming up as high as before." "No more subtleties, then," Thorn said. "I'll push us to the shallows as fast as I can." He took a last sight of where they wanted to go, then reeled in shock as Morag grasped his hand, and a charge of energy swept through him as she cast over the last of her life. His eyes burned with tears, but he clenched his fist and threw his rage into the storm. Now they had a goal, and as the helmsman played with his wheel to keep them from being overmastered, so too did Thorn shape each wave in turn, smoothing the best slope for ascent and recovery. It was the hardest thing he'd ever done. It was magical. It didn't last. Thorn felt a surge of energy up the length of his back. Then doom was upon them all. It was a spell of dissolution, a physical assault designed to reduce them all to their component atoms. The image came to him of an infinite number of fishhooks sunk deep into every particle of his being. He countered by wrapping everybody in swaddling cloth that snugged them back together while also muting the worst of the pain. He wanted to protect Morag as well, but there wasn't enough of him to stretch that far, not if he was to do a proper job of protecting the living. Her flesh spiked outwards, and Shando wailed with grief and rage at this desecration of his wife's body. Thorn felt something hard in his hand, realized without looking that he held an acorn taken from his pouch. Couldn't help a smile of remembrance as he recognized the High Aldwin's gift to him when he left on that first fateful adventure. He charged the seed with power and tossed it to strike Morag where her heart had been. In that twinkling contact, she was transformed. Flesh became stone, and down she went beneath the surface. Now the same force that attacked them turned on their vessel. Nails flew from planks, and then the wood itself tore, one piece from the next, as the glue that bound them, and the enchantments and blessings that reinforced the physical connections were torn asunder. Thorn knew it was dawn, though you couldn't tell by the sky over the beach where they had been tossed. Clouds formed an impenetrable wall across the vault of the sky, dark manifestations of shadow. All but Morag and 2 crew members had survived. After regrouping, they had determined their next move. Shando had insisted he was as unable to live away from water as from Morag, and had made his way along the beach alone. The others were now struggling overland. Jeren, true to his training, had found them a way up the cliff that lined the shore, a narrow trail that fortunately soon gave way to a sloping meadow. Beyond the meadow was forest, where the trees were so ancient, so big around, that all 5 of them with arms linked couldn't surround them. Jeren's focus was the trail. That left Elora in Rin's charge. She progressed in much the same manner as a cow or sheep. When nudged along her way, she went. Cori, on the other hand, couldn't stay still or on the trail. Her vitality appeared as boundless as her reserves of strength. "The forest something special, am I right?" Jeren asked Thorn as they walked. "The trees are consecrated to Sherlindria, said to have been planted by her own hands." "Too damn quiet, and you ask me." "I was wondering about that," Thorn agreed. "Not a sign of life. Not deer, not lizard, not dryad nor nymph." Thorn had walked such stands as these often. The Fairy Queen had planted them where she pleased. They were places where he felt at peace. Here, though, he found desolation, the form of what had been, without the substance. He wasn't aware that he was whistling until he found Elora Danan standing before him, a haunted aspect to her eyes. "I know that music." "Something I used to whistle," he conceded, "when you were very young." Bleakness spread like oil across the sea from her eyes to her voice. "It's my fault. I should have given Willow what he wanted. I'm cursed. The world's cursed. I never meant for anything bad to happen. I was just so scared." "There's no shame in that. You brought me to this. Nothing about my life was wrong until you showed yourself." "Everything was wrong, child," he thought. He was about to say that aloud when he heard a scream from above and was cast into the raging consciousness of Bastion. He was frozen in place by the suddenness of the eagle's attack.
"Oathbreaker!"
he heard Rule cry from his perch on Bastion's shoulders.
"Betrayal!"
This came from Frangine, riding Anila.
"Demon!"
they cried, a word meant to hurt worse than any weapon. His vision bifurcated. He saw himself from Anella's eyes, as her back arched, her great wings breaking her descent, and beheld through his own eyes the eagle's extended claws lunging for his face. He dropped and rolled. Cori leapt up and slashed her sword at the bird. Anella saw at once the demon child's speed and wheeled towards the ravine. Rin had pulled Elora down to clear her out of harm's way, but when the Wern turned from her to Bastion, he was met by an arrow from Rule's bow. Bastion's claws opened bloody stripes across his flank before the eagle surged skyward. Thorn lashed out with a torrent of wind, and Bastion squalled in surprise as he found himself pushed away from his quarry. "Damnation!" Jeren cried as the birds fled down the ravine. "Those birds, Drumheller! They were the ones travel with you!" "Yes." Insight had already presented Thorn with the reason for the eagle's attack. It was embodied in that one awful word they had cried at him. Demon. Becoming one with Cori's sire in order to bring her into the world had cursed him in the eyes of all the Vale folk. They attacked Elora because they feared he had corrupted her as well. Rin was hurt, but assured them he could continue on. "I'll need some time, is all," he said. "Drumheller," Jeren put in. "We may not have any." Thorn breathed in a heady mix of evening scents. "Someone's lit a fire." "That's a fact. We have to move fast." Cori slung Rin over her shoulder as Jeren took off at a jog. "Thank you," a voice said softly from Thorn's side. "You're most welcome, Elora Danan." "Why'd you leave me?" she asked after they walked a while. The ache of loss was naked in her tone. "I thought my work was done. I had a home, family, responsibilities. You were where you rightly belonged, among those best able to protect you. Good thing you left. You might have shared their fate. Or saved them. Elora, do you remember what happened that night?" She shook her head slowly. "I was warm, snug abed. Then I was burning. The fire that claimed Bavmorda had come for me, that's what I thought. Then I was cold, freezing. My bed was gone. Tir Asleen was gone. I was somewhere different. The palace in Anguin. The courtyard, actually. They built me the tower. Elora's eyrie. They were always nice to me, but they were always afraid. All things considered, I guess they had good reason." "Bollocks!" They'd been climbing for a while, and it was now evening. Thorn's legs felt held together by rubber bands. He doubted Elora fared much better, and didn't want to think about Rin. Even Cori was showing the strain. Jeren was waiting as they neared the top of a middling ridge. He was puffing like a bellows. "It's burning, Peck. Fast as wildfire. Trees candling like they was soaked in pitch." There was the sound of crackling now. Smoke was thickening. "Can you manage, Cori?" Thorn asked. Jeren was growing more agitated by the moment. "I run," she said flatly. "Rin dies." "So set him down," Jeren snapped. "Do him quick, as a mercy, and let's be off." "No," Elora cried out. "He risked his life for us. I owe him mine." "He can't go, Highness. We can't stay, simple as that." "He's right," Rin agreed. Jeren tried to make the decision for them, yanking Elora by the arm, but didn't make it farther than a single step before she wiggled her legs between his, in a move she'd seen Cori make, and tripped him up. "Fools!" The Pathfinder turned full face on Thorn. "To place your trust in the Peck when all he does is lead you from disaster to disaster. Should have figured you were in the dungeon for good reason, and b'God left you there. Demon you were named, it's demon you are, and I pray you burn for it!" "You're wrong!" Elora shouted, as Havelhand pumped himself for all he was worth along the steepling rise. "Into the hollow," Thorn instructed them, all business. The humidity was vanishing from the air. Thorn could feel his skin tighten as the ambient moisture was sucked dry. The hollow wasn't deep. Thorn could see over the top by standing erect, but there was nothing better available. An explosion caught his eyes, and he watched a sinuous serpentine shape, colored as though blood were made molten and leavened by pure gold, dive into the trunk of a huge tree. Every leaf burst alight, then fountains of flame rocketed from the ground as the roots were consumed and the tree combusted, brilliantly ablaze. The fire drake leapt to another target. It was the Deceiver's doing, of course. Fire drakes represented one of the primal forces of creation. According to legend, they were born with the universe and swam in the molten hearts of the stars themselves. Only a first-rank mage would even consider summoning one, because only the most all-encompassing of wards could contain their tremendous heat. And the Deceiver had unleashed not a single such horror, but an entire pack. Madness, Thorn breathed. Madness! Thorn went to work on their clothes first, recalling what it was like on Morag's schooner, with the wind howling, the seas booming over the deck. They'd been soaked to the skin, every particle of their being saturated with water. As then, so now. Remember the wet, was his injunction, cast into the earth as well as their clothes. Then the leading edge of the blaze swept over them, and he was weeping with the effort to maintain his spell. "This is different from the ocean," Elora said in his ear. "Yes," he said, not having the breath to spare for a fuller reply. "That was natural. This is something else." "Yes." "Willow's doing. The Deceiver's doing, Elora. Whatever face that creature wears, it isn't Willow. It was never Willow. Is there anything we can do?" "We?" She met his gaze without attempting to hide the fear in her eyes, but also without taking back a word of her offer. "I'd like to try." "As you wish, Most Royal Highness." With a grin of approval, he took a last breath before flinging the cloak of moisture aside and rising into hell. The world was fire. Flames rose to form a roof above them. The ground cracked and seared. Through the fire moved the fire drakes with the boneless sinuosity of eels, kept at bay by the boundaries of Thorn's wards, but never straying far. "It is so beautiful. It's all so beautiful," Elora said. He had to concede that was true. Then she turned to the flames. The barest tip of her finger touched the nearest fire drake, stroking its back the way she might a cat, and it arched with a rapture at the attention. Another twisted knot-like and came straight for her, diving into the child's body as if flesh itself were no barrier between them. Elora began to glow from within as the fire drake slid beneath her skin. She was silver before, now she'd become the essence of sun gold. Her eyes were cobalt pools against a background of flame. The fire drake stared at him from Elora's eyes, and then bid a sad, smiling farewell with her lips. Thorn stood in darkness and thought he'd gone blind. "I guess you really are the sacred princess," Rin said to Elora. She gave him a look that would have made a fire drake quail. "I'm Elora Danan, for what that's worth." "Tonight, gentle friend," Rin said, "it's worth the world to me." Elora, looking beyond him, gasped. A stag stood on the smoothness of the fused earth. It was a magnificent beast with huge antlers, and its majesty was matched by its indomitable will. If the forest had a king, this was truly he. Elora flew to the stag before Thorn could stop her. He knew what she would find. The stag's whole body had been swept by the breath of the devil incarnate. It was seared from crown to hooves, skin made raw, blackened flesh. "There's nothing to be done, save put the poor thing out of its misery." Elora rounded on him. "You're a sorcerer! You're a healer!" Grey dawn, grey day. Another in a series of monotonous dawns, more suited to the polar realms than once temperate Anguin. Thorn held out an apple slice, and the stag's broad tongue snatched it into his mouth. He wasn't a pretty beast by any standards. Thorn drew the limit at cosmetic work, preferring to let nature herself finish that job. His coat was a frazzled patchwork of old growth and new, the skin beneath as tender and pink as a newborn's. Rin wasn't much better off. His bones were healing, the wound itself closed, but he moved with care. Thorn heard the hiss of Corey's sword being drawn, sensed the sudden tension in his companions, but he ignored it as closed eyes presented him with a wholly different view of the scene. Anella tightened her turn to grant him a better view, and his breath seethed in unison with hers at the sight. "We do appear a pathetic bunch," he spoke aloud.
Leave you on your own one damn minute?
Rule groused, landing ahead on Bastion.
You just go straight to hell. Risk our souls simply by talking with you.
Frangine added as Thorn restored vision to his own eyes. There the brownies were in front of him. "Then go!"
Eagles won't let us.
This from Rule.
They seem to feel we did you wrong. We saw you with the stag. Anella, she could see how done in you were. None of us thought you'd last through a single healing after standing up to those flaming watchets, much less two.
"Brownies." It was Alora. Thorn introduced them. "I spoke harshly to you and of you. For that I ask your pardon, as well as for not knowing you sooner."
She may be worth the effort after all, Drumheller,
Rule said. "Right now," Thorn said quietly, "we need shelter, we need food, we need rest." The stag pawed the ground before using his horns to shunt Thorn around until he was facing the mountain of Djumhal ahead. It is the easiest road," Thorn noted. And with stately tread, the stag led them on their way. The stag was picking his way along a trail that meandered around the broad eastern flank of the mountain when Thorn took vision behind Anella's eyes. "There's something about this place," he mused, sharing his thoughts with the eagle as her keen gaze found precisely what he'd been searching for. He returned wholly to himself. "Blessed bride, this is no mountain. I mean, no natural mountain. It's a fortress." Once upon a time, Thorn told them, as the group continued their journey, gods must have walked the world. It was a far wilder time. The powers in play were more elemental, composed of primal forces. Wherever they strode, they left their mark. But they were giants in stature as well as accomplishment, and those who came after too small in every dimension to comprehend the wonders they had wrought. "Djumhal is one such," he told them. "Are you saying somebody made this place Drumheller?" Rin asked. "It's apparent from the air. It's the symmetry, you see. Djumhal Mount, seat of the ancient fortress of Anguin." I thought it was a bedtime story. Something passed down by the kings in Anguin to make them seem better than they were." The whole mountain was an artful blend of optical illusions. Folds in the rock that to the distant observer might be taken for natural deformations, on closer scrutiny became passages and sally ports and ramparts. Thorn had just lit a fire in a hearth that stood half as high as a cathedral when he felt a presence. He turned, as did the others. The great vaulting hall was empty no longer. Throughout their trek from the beach, they'd remarked on the emptiness of the forest. Now they knew why. All stood before them, from the smallest bugs and lizards to full-grown mountain cats and highland rams. Dead center was the stag, and as Thorn rose to his feet and started forward, so did he. Only the beast's aspect changed with every step. Flesh and sinew running like wax, turning him to fox and owl and raven and mouse and spider, so that by the time he finally came to stand before the Nelwyn, he had manifested the form of every creature present, including, at the last, a passable imitation of a daikini still wearing horns. "This was a blessed place," the man said. "All within lived in peace and harmony. The balance is broken. The land screams because its spirit is no more." In his mind's eye, Thorn saw Sherlindria ensnared by the deceiver's web of evil, and knew that the Stag Lord was her mate. "We are all of the world," Thorn replied. "In our way we have all suffered, but we survive, we persevere. So long as one of us lives, there is hope. From that hope, rebirth." "Words!" The Stag Lord's hand flashed up, growing a brace of claws as it swept across Thorn's face.
"We come as friends,"
Thorn cried. "What was once freely given, manling, must now be earned." The Stag Lord thrust out his arm, and Thorn's blood leaped forth, becoming a rough braided whip to rake diagonally across Elora's back from shoulder to hip. "If you would regain your rightful place among us, you must prove yourself worthy." His cry was echoed by the assemblage, redolent with rage and a hunger for vengeance. The slash left a wicked trail across Elora's shirt and should have cut her to the bone, but as they watched, the stain faded away. "She is the great betrayer," accused Cherlindria's forest consort, taking her immunity to his attack as proof.
"Not so," denied Thorn. "She spoke for your life. Doesn't that count for something?"
He confronted the Stag Lord full in the face, as though there was no longer a size difference between them.
"You've seen my heart when I healed you, and through me my friends. We are not your enemies, Lord, and that child is all the hope of the world."
How noble a sentiment, Peck!
Intruded the deceiver's voice. At the same moment, a shape flashed past the corner of Thorn's vision. The eagle's broken corpses, wrapped in a barbed capture net, bounced on the flagstones. Thorn was slashing at the net with his knife when he realized, too late, that the sight before him was a cruel illusion. The barbs reversed themselves to stab through his clothes and fill him with poison as the eagle's forms altered, elongating, bills stabbing outward into something best resembling a rapier. One of the pair of night herons stooped for the Stag Lord, who used his whip to fair effect, raking it across the body of the creature. The heron staggered in flight, a lesion opening across its breast. But that blow had taken all that remained of the whip's power and its sizzle to nothingness. The Stag Lord shifted back to his cervine form. As he reared up on his hind legs to rally all his domain, he was shot by so many crossbows that it seemed as though he'd been turned into a living pincushion. A host of Mason snipers had arrayed themselves in the great hall's gallery. There was a tumult towards the rear of the huge chamber, and a pair of horses burst into view. Anna Carey reined in her mare as the scene came fully into view, but the castellan spurred his mount into a full charge, sending animals scrambling from his path. The snipers cut down those animals who dared to attack, and panic swept the assemblage like a wildfire. The castellan leveled his spear. There was blood on the Stag Lord's muzzle. He angled away from his attacker to share his last glance with Thorn. There was no regret in his eyes. He spun and raked the horse's flank with his antlers. The stallion screamed. There was a cry from the castellan as well, as the animal reared and pitched itself aside, crashing down upon its rider. It was as though that fall was a signal. The Mason archers laid down an indiscriminate fire, targeting the great fanged predators first. Through that chaos surged the Princess Anna Carey, reaching the castellan more quickly than any of his men. The Stag Lord was dead, as was the horse, and Anna Carey's cries went unheard at first amidst the howling of the animals.
"I need a healer!"
she roared, hooking her arms beneath the Mason's shoulders and heaving him free.
Have no fear, my dear,
called the deceiver from the hearth.
'Twill soon turn out all right.
"Modri's dying. Wizard, can you do something about that?"
At the moment, regretfully, no. But your Peck's a healer. Make him an offer he can't refuse.
Anna Carey took Thorn by his bonds, hauling him up, ignoring his grimaces as the barbs stabbed him.
"Fair deal, Peck. The castellan's life for yours."
Instinct spoke for him, with the only movement he could manage, the barest nod of his head. Once released, he tried to take a moment on the floor to gather his wits, but a rough hand grabbed him by the scruff of the neck and set him upright. It was Jerrin Havelhand, in the leathers of a captain of the Red Lions. Corey and Rin had been separated and moved to opposite sides of the fireplace, there lashed against the massive andirons and watched by guards with ready swords. Elora knelt before the fire. Before her, in the heart of the inferno, stood the deceiver. His eyes looked a fraction more hollow, as did the drape of skin below his cheekbones, and the skin itself had lost resilience. Whatever had happened since the Eyrie had visibly diminished him.
Do your work, little sorcerer, while I do mine.
What's this, then? Thorn asked of Jeren as the former Pathfinder escorted him to the fallen warrior. I'm a soldier of the king, I swore an oath. And you? What's your excuse? He demanded of the princess as she unlaced Modri's helm. Jeren cuffed him soundly. She's Princess Royal, and you keep a respectful tongue in your head, Peck, or suffer for it. Anakari pulled Modri's helmet free, and therein Thorn thought lay part of the answer. For all the cruelty and calculation that swam in the Castellan's spirit, he saw in the man's eyes that there was also true feeling for this woman, possibly even love. Please, she asked Thorn, and he knew it cost her to say so. He's dying. Stop stalling, Peck, snapped Jeren, with a not-so-gentle clout to the shoulder. And you'll nae be needin' these. With a twist of his short sword, he severed Thorn's belt and kicked the pouches out of reach. Thorn tried to delay, fingering one of his last 2 acorns he had hidden in his vest pocket. He knew that once he started giving his attention to the Castellan, Elora was doomed.
It's your destiny, Elora Danon,
he heard in his mind from the hearth, and knew the spell of dissolution was once more being woven. Elora had her arms wrapped about herself, and the deceivers wrapped about her, as though the one were enclosing the other, and about them swirled a nexus of flame.
The way of the world is so hard, Elora Danon. So much pain. Let things happen as they were ordained. Embrace the fire. Let it burn away all cares. Let us be one.
Thorn had never seen so artful a seduction. The deceiver spoke lovingly of all the secret places in Elora's heart, as it wove a glorious tapestry of desire with thread drawn from Elora's soul. Another figure came into being before them both, facing the fire, a gossamer frame at first, whose proportions approximated Elora's, and with each caressing phrase the simulacrum grew more real. The deceiver himself had faded away, becoming as translucent as glass. The same delicate threads that had been drawn from Elora now emerged from the deceiver's own flesh. Thorn's mouth opened to cry a last denial, but it was Elora who spoke. It was the voice that came to her on Morag's schooner, erupting from the bottom of her belly, a cry of defiance coupled with a fierce lunge from the flames. Then she smashed through her likeness and tumbled to the floor. That same moment, Anella swooped for Jeren's eyes. He'd have lost them for sure had Anakari not kicked the young Daikini's legs out from under him. He was up in an instant, sword in hand, but the eagle was gone. He turned to lash out at Thorn, but the Nelwyn had followed her example. Cori was free, Frangine's doing, with sword in hand and a growing sense of how to use it. Rin was loose as well. Thorn reached Elora as a gout of ice fire exploded from the deceiver's hand. He thought they both were dead. But the flames passed her by, and him as well, and he pitched his acorn right into the heart of the inferno. There was a tiny, brilliant pop of light, and the flames rushed headlong back the way they'd come to engulf the whole of the magical fire that filled the hearth. The deceiver had time for a look of true astonishment, and then, with a congratulatory tip of the head to Thorn, began to laugh. The echoes of it lasted long after the entity itself had turned to stone. Thorn cast about for a weapon to smash the statue to powder. What came instead was Jeren, and Thorn dropped flat in a diving roll that sent the Daikini sprawling. Jeren was on his feet before he stopped rolling. Unfortunately, he found himself facing Rin. The Pathfinder made a fair try, but while he had training and heart, the Wern, even wounded, far overmatched him in skill. When Jeren was down, Rin and Thorn made tracks for their friends. Elora scooped up a cudgel and laid into the nearest mason with a vengeance she must have been storing up for years. She got in one good swing, then another mason looped her about the legs with his whip. Cori faced a pair, and they were very good. She used the andiron for cover, sliding back and forth between her foes, touching one blade, then the other, her agility saving her when the sword couldn't manage. Anella soared across the scene, and Cori took a silent cue from Thorn and plucked the eagle from the air, tucking her close to her side to save her from mason arrows. "Lay down your weapons," called Anakeri. "I won't offer twice." Thorn had sidled behind the two of them, drawing Elora with him until his back was to the wall. He had no idea whether what had worked in the dungeon would apply here. "Elora, do you trust me, girl?" "I think so, yes." "Step behind me, then." And when she'd done that, "Wrap your arms around me and hold tight." He grabbed Corey by the belt and Rin by his back fur and heaved the lot of them backwards with him into the wall. "Are we safe?" Elora asked, when at long last they emerged into an upper gallery. "I'd say no," Thorn replied to them all. "Not so long as the Mason have Jeren to lead their hunt."
"Do you do that often?" wondered Rin to Thorn. "Stroll through solid rock?"
"I'm learning as I go, much like Corey and her sword."
"Like unto died, girl," Corey said to Elora, "when I saw you face that flame."
"She wasn't the only one," added Thorn. "Elora Dannon, whatever possessed you?" "I'm immune, at least so you've said, to spells and such." Thorn let out his breath. "Quite possibly, but that was no time for an acid test. You'd have died otherwise. Besides, it was the only answer that made sense. If I'm so important to this deceiver, he can't very well kill me." "Gods!" Thorn whispered, simultaneously aghast and awestruck by what she'd done. "You have no idea, not the slightest conception. Through you, he did such feats as legends are made of. And that very likely was the force that destroyed Tir Asleen. Bavmorda wanted you dead. This one means to put you on body and soul like a suit of clothing. Your saving grace, even after all that's happened, is that he thinks you are nothing. That's your salvation, child, not some precious immunity." Rin noticed Anakeri's silver hair clip, which Thorn had put in his hair. "Drumheller, where did you get that?" "It's the princess's. Why?" The Wern began, then broke off as Thorn's expression changed markedly. "The mountain's beginning to stir." In that moment, Thorn found himself called to Bastion's eyes. The eagle was high in the rafters of the great hall, very quiet, as he and Rule had been from the start. From the eagle's eyes, Thorn saw that Anakari had led the Mason in pursuit of the fugitives, leaving a pair of thunder riders with the castellan. Thorn watched as both warriors were speedily, silently slain. A call from within the hearth brought both men close. After all, they'd seen their quarry disappear into the stone. They gave the petrified statue of the deceiver what they thought was a decent berth. It wasn't enough. 2 puffs of frigid flame in both their faces, and their lungs were instantly freeze-burned. They suffocated, gasping for air. Modri saw, and to his credit, tried his feeble best to avenge them. The thing imprisoned in the statue emerged as energy from some place far beyond human ken. With each step, it coalesced until once more the deceiver had reclaimed the face of Willow Ufgood. With the last of his strength, Modri thrust up his sword straight through the center of Willow's chest. The deceiver's smile was terrible to behold. "Ah, Modri, I should have kept you on a tighter rein. Now, I suppose I shall." Filaments burst from the falseling's flesh and plunged into the castellan. The big man began to glow, his eyes going wide as he found himself lifted from where he lay until he and the deceiver floated face to face. At his touch, Modri stiffened into death. Within another heartbeat, there was nothing left of the shape that called itself Willow Ufgood. Hale and healed, Castellan Modri filled the chamber with laughter, resounding in its contempt as its triumph. Then he was gone, into the wall, dancing himself through the stone as Thorn had done. Only his passage wasn't so courteous as the Nelwyn's, and the mountain didn't like it. The group in the gallery felt more than heard a low, tearing groan. "He's coming for me," Elora cried. Ignoring Corey's protest, Thorn stepped away from the others and into the stone. This battle would be his. That's when Jeren and the Mason found them. Jeren lunged after Rin. Elora Danan was on his back before he could go farther, doing what damage she could with voice and fists as she fumbled for Thorn's pouches that were strung from Jeren's belt. But the distraction allowed Rin to recover his own blades, and he came back for Jeren, and the battle was joined. Cori and Rin stood back to back, with Elora between their legs, and struck pretty much as they pleased. That was when a pair of sable arms rose up from the floor to yank Elora into the mountain. Modri clutched her by the hair. Drumheller was to her right, but she had no notion how to move to him. The blackness of the surrounding stone had grown color, brilliant strands of energy sizzling outwards from the two sorceress combatants, as though they were weavers in a race to see who could craft the more eloquent tapestry. Modri completed one. A small patterning of knots and sigils, and radiance flared from it to Thorn, who thrust out with his hands to break the force of the attack and wove a pattern of his own. Elora felt the castellan draw her hair so taut she was sure it would tear loose from her scalp as he forced her to look at him.
Yield!
No! The deceiver had no chance to try again. She stood at the gates of her own soul and gaped to see them whole. A small measure of her worth, but enough to give her heart, to give her hope. Thorn's lighted tendrils caught Modri by the extremities to bind him fast, and in that moment, Elora's legs came up, and she placed her feet flat against his armored chest. He still had a hand on her, the other tearing at Thorn's magic strands. Her kick put both heels in his eyes. He was human enough to reel at the impact, and that was all she needed.
"We know you, deceiver!"
issued from Thorn's mouth. She felt at the back of her throat a resonance of the power that gripped him and prompted her to speak as well. "As you have marked us, so shall we you." In the blink of an eye, the stone around them was transformed, the whole mountain changing from solid state to liquid, as though some monstrous grate had been removed to allow the fire at the heart of the world to claim this new territory. A slab of stone crashed free, taking them with it, pitching them from an immaterial realm to one that was all too tangible. The mountain wasn't groaning anymore. It had woken with a roar to shake the heavens and the earth. The floor split before them, one side cast up, the other down, two voices lost in the shriek of shredding stone as Thorn and Elora were carried apart. What had been a level passage was now a flight of jagged steps, more appropriate to the giants who built this place than those who roamed it today. At the same time, huge sections of the wall fell away, giving a view straight to roiling lava below. The main body of Mason were a fair way below, cut off from their prey by a wide crevasse of granite that the lava was rapidly filling. "Drumheller!" Elora called. "Stay where you are! I'll come down!" He'd forgotten the other heron. He was hanging by his fingers, scrabbling with toes for a flaw in the facing, when a brace of knife points stabbed him in the back. The bird stabbed with its beak to punch through the back of his skull, but he ducked his head aside and got a face full of rock splinters instead. The eagles saved him, tearing at the heron with beak and claws. Their intervention gave Thorn the opportunity he needed. He had one acorn left. He popped it right into the bird's mouth. It shattered quite nicely on the step below. So would have he, had not Elora intervened. The impact carried them both to their backside. "What happened here?" she demanded. "What's happening?" "There's a soul and spirit to these mountains, just as there is to each of us. The deceiver is their enemy as much as ours. I asked for their help against them." They heard Jeren's voice. "Elora! Elora Danan!" He'd evidently been caught on a separate outcrop. Worse, it had begun to open a gap, and the rock above offered no decent purchase to continue his climb. Elora burrowed frantically into Thorn's pouches. "Why don't you have a rope in here?" Because it was what she truly desired, it came to her hand, complete with a grappling hook. "Elora Danan, help me!" Thorn reached for the rope, but Elora wrenched it from his grasp. "You're still dealing with the wounds from the night heron. You're not strong enough for this." She didn't know how to climb. What she managed was slightly better than a controlled collapse as she dropped to a jarring landing on Jeren's ledge. The Daikini caught hold of the end of her rope. "Drumheller!" Jeren called. "I have the rope. Haul up the sacred princess. I'll follow after." "He can't," Elora told him. "He was hurt by the heron."
I'll have your heart, Drumheller, for allowing the sacred princess to place herself in such danger, Jaren hissed as he secured the line snugly about Alora's torso. It was my choice, Trooper. You're too important. You should know better. He pulled her snug to his back in a rescue carry, with her legs wrapped around his waist. Hold tight, he told her. He stepped off his ledge and swung toward the wall. There were cries from far below as a new figure joined the mason. It was Modri, held erect by a mason at each shoulder. We heard him, Drumheller, Elora cried exultantly. Up above, Rin and Cori had joined Thorn at the rope, while Anakari stood close by. The princess was staring at Modri, lips parted in horror at his miraculous recovery. I tell you true, Thorn said to the princess. He is not what he seems. Thorn, Elora called as she and Jaren cleared the lip of the main riser. You're the cause of all this misery, the Pathfinder cried as he launched toward Thorn. Then he had his blade clear and swung it to make Cori keep her distance as well. Jaren, no! The cry came from Anakari as she threw herself in his path. The young man stared in horror as his princess crumpled to his feet, the act of falling pulling her body clear of the blade that had impaled it. He'd run her right through. Put down your sword, Jaren, said Rin. The Daikini lunged for him, swinging his sword with a near berserker intensity. I made an oath, and you made me betray it! When the Wern moved, he was a blur of mahogany, using one shoulder to deflect the blade, while the other caught Jaren in the chest. Rin received a fresh wound in the flank. With a speed that outdid Rin's, Jaren slashed through the rope binding Elora, then sprang for his fallen princess, and the two figures disappeared over the edge. Rin threw himself after them, stretching himself full length on the slab, dreading what he'd see below. Jaren and Anakari had landed on a small outcrop. We're not your enemies, Rin cried. It's the Mason you should be fighting. Made me choice, swore me oath. I'll be true to both. He tied the rope about Anakari's torso. You say the Mason's the enemy, yet my princess, she rides with him. She loves the Castellan true. With him's where she rightfully belongs. He dropped her off the ledge toward the Castellan, carefully controlling her descent. They have her, Cori announced. Elora plunged to her knees at the edge of the slab. Jaren, throw us the rope. We'll pull you up. Jaren gave a wild smile. I don't think so, sacred princess, but I thank you for the thought. The ground shook again, and with another awful crack, the face of the slab opened before them. For the Princess Royal, the Pathfinder cried as the cliff gave way around him. His last words before the fire claimed him. For Angwin! Doomhall's death throes were a great, glowing cauldron of raw fire. The peak itself had collapsed in the night to form a monstrous caldera, easily a mile across, canted upland from the Dewatha headlands and the King's Gate, and frozen Angwin beyond. Of the Mason, there was no sign, which was hardly a surprise, since they'd been on the south side of the peak when it blew. Thorn sensed the Deceiver wouldn't be following either, at least not right away. Too much had happened, too quickly. The fiend had actually been hurt. He'd have to recover before making another move. So would Anakari. Rin was hunting, Cori sitting sentry near the cave where they'd taken refuge. They'd traveled far enough north to pass the fringes of the storm. It was a hard climb to find Elora, perched atop the hill, where she had a view of burning Doomhall. He brought a steaming mug of broth, fresh from the cookpot, and she wrapped her hands around the mug to warm them before hazarding a sip. I wish I had the opportunity to return this, he said, mostly to himself, fingering Anakari's silver hair clip. Is she a friend, Drumheller, or foe? Elora asked. Yes. That's no answer. No, she sniffed, very much a girl who'd hardly begun the journey of her life. I miss my bear. I beg your pardon? My bear. I had it in my arms when I came to Angwin.
An impulse drew Thorn's hand to his pouch. "Bear," Elora said in a whisper, not daring to believe the sight. "How?" she asked Thorn. "You've Corey's sire to thank." "The demon? I think he snuck it into my pouch before our escape. He's yours, isn't he? You made Bear for me." He nodded. "You know, I always told myself that it was Bear who saved me. Well, I asked him to look after you. Thank you, Thorn. With all my heart." She turned to her left, looking past Doom Hall, toward the glow that could no longer be seen thanks to the volcano's fury. "Many will blame you for this." "Very likely, I'm afraid. Everyone's going to choose up sides. Some might join the deceiver willingly, others may well be overthrown. Some will decide the safest place is on the sidelines. The best, I hope, will cast their lot with you. It's a war, then. Against the shadow, yes." "I didn't want Jaren to die," she said softly, after a silence. "Nor I. But that's the way of things sometimes. Thank you for saving me." He stretched his arm across her shoulder and drew her close. She snuggled in his lap like his own daughter, and he stroked her hair. "I did my part," he told her, "as did we all. But when it counted, Elora Danan, you saved yourself." Then, for what felt like the first time in a lifetime, he let a smile of true joy crease his weathered features, and he sang the hope of the world to a deep and gentle sleep. This is René Aubergenois. We hope you've enjoyed this production of Shadow Moon by George Lucas and Chris Claremont. This program was produced by David Rapkin and directed by Lars Hoel. Abridgment by Trebby Johnson. Shadow Moon is a production of Lucasfilm Limited. Copyright 1995. All rights reserved. The book, Shadow Moon, is available wherever Bantam books are sold. Look for Book 2 of the Saga of the Shadow War, coming soon to bookstores everywhere.